All right, welcome to another episode of Jay's Analysis. Of course, this time I have two of my more recent favorite people in the sense of camaraderie when it comes to not just film analysis, but also orthodoxy. I have my buddies from Psyop Cinema. And if you've been listening, I went on their podcast recently and we covered some pretty interesting stuff, including a Jungian dark surrealist film called Come True. And then I've been listening to their other installments where they go into analyzing religious engineering from the perspective of Nolan films, Revelation the Method in Nolan films, The Green Knight, and now they're doing Snyder films. So I'm going to let them give a kind of an introduction to their podcast, how they got going, and then maybe a little bit about what they've been talking about recently. And then we'll get into where we plan to go tonight, which is to analyze a few weird selections. There will be the 1990 installment of Hardware, which I've been meaning to analyze for a long time because the director said that Hollywood is a Gnostic empire. Some comment like that, where he pointed out that Hollywood is basically just pure Gnosticism. And we see this in Hardware. And then we're going to be looking at Empty Man, a more recent film that had to do with Tibetan Buddhism, Tulpas, and perhaps even worse than that. And then we're going to be looking at the Luc Besson, I think it's 90 or 91 film, La Femme Nikita, which is a pretty well-known spy film, because I thought there was some direct relevance to recent things with Jeff Stein-Epry, if you know what I'm talking about, because that was I think there's a lot of mind control. There's a lot of, sexual programming, et cetera, going on in that film, which was way ahead of its time in terms of, the public really not having any clue about any of that stuff going on. So we'll be looking at it here in a minute, but guys, tell me a little bit about Psyop Cinema, its origins, and maybe both of your backgrounds a little bit, and then we'll launch into these films.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, as you said, we at Psyop Cinema, we look at cinema from the perspective of cultural engineering or religious engineering, looking at cinema as a form of, mass mind control, low intensity sort of mass mind control. I mean, I personally, I was a film buff from a very young age, and got really into art films and stuff when I was a teenager, and was also sort of immersed in philosophical nihilism as well as cultural nihilism, basically. And then, sort of this spiritual journey that was running, parallel with my being a film buff led me to stuff like Jungian psychology. And I discovered that film is, it's also a sort of window into the unconscious, the collective unconscious, as it were. You can look at films as collective dreams. And I've been interested in conspiracy theory and just politics in general. Also for me, growing up watching the X-Files and,
absolutely,
and stuff like that. JFK, I mean, I love Oliver Stone, still love Oliver Stone. And, so then bringing this sort of conspiracy sort of perspective, parapolitics, deep politics, we prefer to call it, sort of perspective to bear on this stuff. And I mean, so the other component is I guess the occult side of it, right? And that's understanding, that knowledge of how the psyche works and how it's sort of manipulated and engineered through spiritual symbols, and how that sort of knowledge could be deployed using certain technologies, right? And where would that be taking place? It would be taking place in Hollywood. And in fact, when you start going down this rabbit hole, right, you find some many interesting things indeed. So I mean, that's kind of the origin of Psyop Cinema from my end, and Thomas.
Would you say it's mainly looking at religious engineering or just social engineering as a whole through cinema?
Yeah, I mean, I think primarily, I mean, it's both. I mean, we're open to, we focus on cinema, we're open to a lot of kind of deep politics currents. I mean, we when you were on the show, we discussed a lot of different things, but I mean, I think at least for me, kind of like the big idea of what I'm bringing to the show is, religion is sort of fundamental to what people are. So I mean, there's a debate, that's been going on in the humanities concerning, like, are people fundamentally economic? Are they fundamentally sexual, like Freud says, or whatever? But then, people like Merche Eliade said, when people are fundamentally religious, and
Mhm.
not endorsing like Mircea Eliade, but he would agree with Christians, for example. Yes, we think people are fundamentally religious or fundamentally spiritual, but having that knowledge, right? I mean, if you really wanted to operate on people at a very deep level, you would go after, sure, you would go after economic systems and politics and things like that as well, but there's an extraordinary power in engineering people's religious beliefs. We're just doing this work on Zack Snyder, and he just openly says that I'm engineering. He says that, yeah, he's combining sort of myth and reality to re-engineer people's religious beliefs. So they say,
Yeah, I heard you
this.
say that in that podcast, and I was like, wow, I didn't realize he was that open about it. I figured he would be more, oh, I don't even care about that. Who cares about religion? But I think, yeah, Hollywood is a lot more religious than people tend to think.
Yeah, kind of like Brett's saying, just cultural engineering in general, once you analyze it, just really lends itself to the study of religious engineering, because that's where the cultural psyop is going. That's where the really big guns are. There's all these kind of secular forms of these ideologies that that people like you talk about and analyze. But then, as people know who watch your show and read your books, Jay, that the real heart of it is esoteric. Esoteric in the sense of not just hidden, but specifically as connected to esoteric spirituality, to occultism. And that's really what's coming down the pipeline, and the ideas that we're seeing mainstream more and more. And that's, with the Snyder thing, that's just one example of the quiet part being said aloud, because really it is a religious program, and the Hollywood is, kind of the cultural part of a much broader, just like system of espionage and deception and propaganda and all of these things. But it's being used specifically more and more for religious purposes. And like, that's kind of my background in getting into to all of this, is that I was immersed for a lot of my life in both pop culture and spirituality and religion. As somebody who grew up fairly evangelical Christian, and then abandoned those beliefs as an adult, I was kind of like cast through all the sea of these different forms of religious syncretism, and studying comparative religion academically and things like that. And eventually I got interested in things like the study of the paranormal or the study of the occult. I wrote a master's thesis on the Hermetic tradition in Western esotericism. And all while I was studying these things and viewing these things as largely positive, I'm also just injecting movies into my psyche all the time. I'm going to the movie theater, just like many weekends, and just like being so fascinated by pop culture and having a largely positive view of all of it. But really what began to shift things for me was kind of getting the more conspiratorial perspective, the more deep politics or parapolitical perspective on what's going on in the world. And once you have the sense that there's something deeply wrong happening, that there are some very powerful, very bad people who have the capacity to engage in mass manipulation, and we can see from the historical record are doing so, that inevitably has to change your perspective on something like pop culture, or on something like all of these pop spiritualities, the new age, pop syncretism, pop occultism, all of these forms of new religious movements that are popping up now. And I found myself immersed in all of these things for so much of my life. And then eventually I realized that there's so much negativity, so much darkness, so many malign influences, just so many bad, alarming ideas about humanity and its future coming from all of these places. So Psyop Cinema, just like came together just because Brett and I were both PhD students studying religion, and we're in the same department, and we just share a lot of these intuitions. Psyop Cinema is not an Orthodox podcast per se, but both Brett and I are Orthodox Christians, and your work in apologetics, Jay, were a very big influence on both of us, and kind of coming to there from, at least speaking for myself, I wasn't just studying the occult, I was practicing it, and I was very immersed in chaos magic and a lot of these other forms of contemporary occultism, and came to see those things as a very negative influence in my life. And with Psyop Cinema, what we're trying to do is really shine a light on what's kind of going on. What are the specific mechanics of these cultural psyops, of culture in general as a psyop, and to like really train ourselves to like look for the messaging in movies, really to build on the angle that one of the angles of your work and from the work of people like Jason Horsley, of really seeing like what is the messaging going on from these popular directors. Like, how do we read a movie so that you're not being just like openly and actively manipulated by it, just to really ask what's going on. So Psyop Cinema is really Brett and I deprogramming ourselves in real time, and hoping that the audience comes along with us on that journey.
Exactly. Yeah, that's essentially what we're after here. Is it's a deprogramming venture. And, a lot of people, by the way, have commented over the years that they kind of lose a lot of the enjoyment that they have for, popular cinema, modern films, because they see so much of the propaganda. And well, that's part of it. I mean, wouldn't you rather be able to deconstruct that and see what's really going on than to just kind of go along and get your entertainment fix or whatever? So that's what we want to do, is to deprogram the propaganda, because so many films, so many stories, unfortunately, are propaganda. It doesn't have to be that way, but that's just the fact of the matter where we are in society, where these actual programs of funding propaganda in films have taken us. So do you guys have a preference for which film you want to start with tonight? I've seen most of these more than once, so I know them pretty well. I have quite a few notes in front of me, but I'll let you guys pick where you want to start. Oh, by the way, in terms of chaos magic, I want to ask you about that, because I noticed some strands of that in hardware, because what we're going to notice in hardware is a kind of a, as I said, Gnostic presentation, but not just that, the notion of self-creation, the notion of spontaneous, creation, consciousness as an emergent property of the universe that just pops into existence. That's going to be present in hardware, as goofy as it was. But I do want to ask you about, because that's, again, when I was on with you guys, we were talking about, I think we talked about chaos magic, and I was pointing out how I'd been listening to one of the guys saying that, reality just pops into existence. The universe pops into existence, consciousness pops into existence, life pops into existence. So why can't a new emergent AI god pop into existence, right? It's like just consistent with the logic there of, self-creation and so forth. But
yeah, maybe we should start with hardware, since that's a good thread to pick up on.
Yeah, and I've got a lot of notes on that. So let's whoever wants to can kick it off with what they thought about hardware.
Well, I guess just start off with a comment about what Jason mentioned there. I mean, so hardware, I don't know if there is a chaos magic element to it. Stanley claims he was an atheist at that time. He claims that he that he became, quote, a pagan or neo-pagan over the last couple of decades, I guess, beginning with his documentary, The Secret Glory, about Otto Rahn, who is this strange archaeologist who ended up tangled with the SS and was genuinely looking for the Holy Grail. I mean, right now, Stanley lives in the Pyrenees. He still talks about these Cathar legends. So he's very steeped in occultism and magic. And so it wouldn't surprise me, though, even back then, that it was those kind of themes were in the front of his mind.
Yeah, a couple things to pick out there. One is just looking at the kind of ideological resonance between these different strands. Like sometimes there's not a direct connection, as someone like Stanley might not have read, Peter Carroll, one of these chaos magicians, but they're all swimming in the same waters. These same ideas are being advanced in so many different fronts that's a good thing to pick out when you're analyzing cultural and religious engineering, is just kind of the connection of just resonance between, these are all part of the same broader push through propaganda and culture, and direct ideological lineages. Those things can both be at play. I suspect it's mostly resonance in this case, but given the neo-pagan thing, I mean, chaos magic and neo-paganism are two very intertwined movements. They certainly were both a big part of my life for a while, and that's the case with a lot of people who get into chaos magic. But yeah, just in general, the idea of reality being programmable, of reality just being a giant slate of different things for you to constantly be divinizing yourself and remaking what reality is. That's a lot of the message of chaos magic, is that reality is nothing but tools for remaking reality. So it's really nonsensical and incredibly weak epistemology, but it's this idea of constantly divinizing oneself by just basically being as chaotic as possible with your epistemology. And something with hardware to keep in mind is just the technology angle. We talked a little bit on the on our podcast when you were on about Peter Carroll and cyber magic. And so this is a strain of occultism.
That's what I was thinking of, yeah.
That exists now, that's very much about bringing together kind of ancient occult lineages and ideas with using modern technological resources as part of this drive towards just divinization of the magician. And so there's a lot of things that we can pick out. In fact, I have a lot to say about this aspect of hardware, about the kind of eroticizing of hybridity of humanity and technology, which comes out in a somewhat vaguer, more undeveloped way in this movie, but then in a lot of forms of contemporary occultism and just other forms of, like, I think, elite ideology, you have a very developed idea of this. But just to say that chaos magic is one example of something that would bring together like a lot of things about like engineering your own sexuality and gender bending and those kind of things with technological engineering and that more tangible like front in terms of computation and cyber magic and all of that.
So I was thinking of Descartes initially with the idea of the universe as a giant machine, which is, you know, the dominant idea of the Enlightenment when it comes to like a deistic attitude and sort of a self-perpetuating machine. And then the deists eventually dispense with the intentional creator. So the universe goes from being teleological to dysteleological. And then what happens is that with the nihilistic attitude of modernity at the same time as the advance of tech, you get the idea of the tech guy as the magus, the tech guy, as you said, as the person who's able to now re-inject purpose and teleology into the world. So now it's teleological again, but not from something that's exterior to man. It's actually man that becomes the agent of purpose and teleology. And yet in this film, it's a kind of techno-nihilism, because the humans aren't actually the humans are sort of accidentally creating the thing that becomes the potential God machine, right? This bot, this Mark 13, which is intended to reference, right, Mark 13, the passage in Mark's gospel, which is the Olivet Discourse, which is the apocalyptic discourse of Christ. And so he's given this name, of course, no flesh shall be spared, which is foreshadowing the depopulation agenda, which comes up in the film, that ultimately the government had the program to program these bots to do this. And then it's almost like they start to take on, I know I'm jumping way ahead, but the ending is what gives the context and meaning to the beginning of the film. So when the bot sort of takes on its own self-consciousness, when it sort of comes alive and then even has the sort of, I was unclear as to whether it was really dead people speaking to the robot, or whether it was the robot that had just recorded all of the, you know, the conversations of the people that had died and was just spitting it back out. But either way, it's really the potential of a Deus ex machina, a god from within the machine that can take over and destroy man. And yet it has this apocalyptic element to it. So, you know, my thought was, I know the chaos magicians, the Crowley sphere, they're obsessed with the end times. They're obsessed with Babylon. They're obsessed with, you know, Babylon the Great, the harlot, being the means by which the end comes. And of course, Crowley, Parsons, all of that crew thought that you could really basically merge man and machine. They were transhumanists of a sort. Cyber magic appears. I'm not an expert in Peter Carroll, but that's where I was going with this, is that, I mean, listening to Carroll's lectures, you know, he talks about, again, the universe just being a thing that can just pop into, it's just chaos, right? Anything can happen. Like, it can just come into being. Robots can become gods. Men can become anything. Women, you know, anything can happen. And so it's a chaotic universe where meaning is not discovered. It's imposed by the will of the strongest, the strongest mages.
Yeah, exactly. There is no center to the chaos magic universe aside from the magician himself. There's no foundation otherwise, other than the magician in that moment of conjuring or sorcery, like gaining power. And I don't think chaos magic is going to be like the final wave of where this ideological program of culture is taking us, just because it's too nonsensical, it's too relativistic and solipsistic, and like really there's a more coherent, more Luciferian paradigm that also has those Crowleyan influences that I think ultimately would supplant something like chaos magic. And something like Hardware or Empty Man can both like get us this idea of all of these ideas are going to be thrown at the wall just to destabilize foundations. But yeah, I mean, you talked about the end of the movie, and like I think part of what is going on here is like just like the hopelessness of the one bad robot got fought off, but then like, oh, there's so many more going to be manufactured. So really it leaves us like no other option other than just kind of wallowing in this dystopian hopelessness of the inevitability of this kind of rising up of the machine to eradicate humanity. And like that depopulation theme is obviously really key to what's going on here.
Yeah.
And any comments?
Oh yeah, I was going to say, I mean, and Stanley, I mean, he admits to it pretty openly, right? That it's a work of just pure cultural nihilism, and there's no merging of man and machine. Machine just represents pure destruction, and humanity is going to be, is going to be wiped out. But yeah, I just wanted to make that comment. He's definitely confirmed that it was just that it's just an absolutely nihilistic vision that he's presenting.
Right. He said something along the lines of, "I did something I've never done before, which was just to dump in a monster that would kill everyone." So creating a depressing context, and then just carnage. So I mean, so it's basically this kind of thing of everything is depressing. So rather than deal with reality, just provide this false catharsis of this hyper violent act in which everyone gets killed. So just destroy. It's very Gnostic in like the impulse to just destroy the world because the world's not perfect. To these hard binaries between like if everything is not is not perfect and polished. If there's hard things in the world, then everything must just be like fundamentally hopeless. Rather than dealing with the imperfections of the world in a healthy way, which of course would be embracing and defending humanity through exactly what these characters don't have access to, through embracing family and children and religious and philosophical foundations, exactly the kind of things that this movie is trying to like steer people away from.
Well, a couple other interesting points at the beginning too. It's also a Harvey Bob Weinstein production, so the Weinsteins are, of infamous note in that regard, which will relate to things we'll talk about maybe in Femme Nikita. But it's this typical dystopian world where we have the scavenging, wasteland type scenario, the rogue Han Solo type guy played by Dylan McDermott. It's a barter economy, but yet there's still a lot of the this seems to be a tech dominated society even still, with radiation and all the kind of typical post-apocalypse bad weather scenarios that we have. It's we hear the radio. It's actually Iggy Pop on the radio, and by the way, Lemmy from Motorhead also makes a curious cameo in this film. But we hear on the radio that there is a sterilization center, and that everybody should make their way over to the sterilization. So it's a very dysgenics based society in this dystopia. And not only that, it's also, like you said, my first note was that extremely nihilistic, because as we look through the way the market works when they go, it's very Blade Runner-esque, where there's like, just basically a big mass of the market is just nonsense. It's basically every culture blended into a giant melting pot. Everybody lives in slums, high-rise slums. The screens dominate everyone's life still. And I noticed when she's flipping through the channels, there's basically nothing but just total theater of brutality. Is every channel is, basically 9 Inch Nails videos versus flipping over to like the whipping channel where people are just getting whipped the whole time. So nothing but basically degradation in terms of the culture. So every element of this film, as you said, the director said, is totally nihilistic. There's nothing in this except for Jill seems to be seeking escape in art. And so she just smokes weed and basically builds these strange metallic structures for her artwork. Meanwhile, the whole civilization is basically collapsing, and it's all because of supposedly too many people. And her boyfriend, Dylan McDermott, is basically this just drifter guy who's a scrap collector. But he's named Moses, so he has this strange sort of deliverance idea, which it's weird because even the nihilistic stories, like if you think of Fight Club, or if you think of this, it's like or even Empty Man, maybe to a degree, it's like they still have the desire for some kind of deliverance even within total destruction. It's like they want somebody to present some level of hope. And as we said, even though this film doesn't actually leave you with any hope, because after the last robot, or after this never dying robot's destroyed, we actually find out that, oh, everybody go get a job, by the way, down at the what I forget what it's called, something, the something corporation that's going to be building the whole army of these bots, right? So there's essentially no redemption ultimately, but there's still the sliver of hope that I guess some viewers want. But even in terms of like the characters are all pretty dingy, right? Really, Jill is the only one that's kind of has some semblance of humanity and morals, because her neighbor, right? The pervy guy who just watches them the whole time. Dylan McDermott is like basically a boyfriend who just skips town whenever he wants to. There's no really good characters in it, right? Shades is basically just a zonked out meditating weirdo. Oh, the other element was the drug culture, right? So basically weed is legalized, everybody just meditates. The only religions seem to be just the popularized versions of Far Eastern religions, you know, yoga or some kind of weird, you know, just basically doing drugs and staring at Kali. I mean, it's like, again, nihilistic, right? The religious imagery is all nihilistic, even though we have certain characters with biblical names like Moses. We have references to Mark III, the Apocalypse, and we have the robot actually being called the Mark 13, excuse me, Mark 13, not 3, Baal, right, which is an acronym for something autonomous, blah blah blah, basically AI. So anyway, I'm rambling because I'm summarizing the story, but I just thought it was really interesting that the elements of this society are all nihilistic, even to the point that the milk, did you notice that her milk was like plasma milk and syntha milk?
Yeah.
Everything is basically fake, synthetic, and seen through a layer of technology.
Yeah, I mean, well, I mean, just the to speak to the drug aspect of it and the nihilism aspect, what's remarkable about this film, though, is it isn't just, I mean, because there's a lot of, you can point to a lot of stuff, especially after, you know, 1990, that where all those sort of elements are on display. But this film's interesting because it's sort of revealing like how it affects society, how toxic culture is actually affecting society, and
yes,
how depopulation agendas, you know, because if you just look at the characters, it's Mo is, I mean, Jill survives, you know, but the Mark 13s are going into mass production as soon as she kills the Mark 13. So we know the robots really win. It's a Pyrrhic victory. But Mo, his death is the real drama of the movie. It's like, and it's so revealing how he dies, right? Is that the Mark 13 doesn't like cut his head off or anything, it injects him with a drug.
Yeah.
With a narcotic, where he's like tripping, and then he's tripping while he's watching like this like endless flow of technocratic propaganda and, like you said, gore videos and BDSM stuff, and he's in this like dream state, and like the robot is just very weird. Like the robot is sort of like becomes this non-threatening sort of presence, even if it's killing. And then it causes him to mutilate himself, which reminds you of Empty Man, right? Because Empty Man makes you kill yourself. So it actually makes you kill yourself, right? It's like culture making you kill. It's this.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, so that's, to me, I mean, that's revelation of the method right there. It's showing you that this Hollywood and, you know, this toxic culture in general is basically inviting you to commit psychic suicide.
Well, the song too, the song that was kind of a minor hit, which actually gets quite a bit of play on, even Alex plays it all the time. It gets played on a lot of conspiracy podcasts and radio shows, because the lyrics of the song, this is what you want, this is what you get, this is what you want, this is what you get. It's almost as if you're opting into this. So everybody's opting into the technocracy, and this is why it's producing so much destruction, is that we're all opting into it. This is what you want, this is what you get.
Well, in Mo's death, that's signaled by the fact that he kills himself with the cyborgian arm. So that's, Mo is anti-technocracy. He's kind of a rebel. He also believes in procreation, unlike all the other characters.
Yeah,
Jill has given up on
kids,
procreation.
exactly. Yeah.
Because with Jill, the cultural nihilism is convinced, even though she's not for the government or anything, but the cultural nihilism has convinced her that, well, you still can't breed, right. You know, and that's what they really care about, right? Is you just not breeding. You know, they want, there's too many people. But Mo's like, no, I mean, I think people, I mean, I have the quotes here, but basically he just tells her, yeah, he really believes that's, but he himself has already merged with the machine, and the machine part of himself is what's going to kill him. So it's too late, you know, that sort of, because he refers to a survival of the fittest, a sort of social Darwinist philosophy that he believes in. So he becomes a victim of his own social Darwinist philosophy. Humanity becomes a victim of its own social Darwinist philosophy. This is the darkest possible vision of transhumanism. And but yeah, it's just very revelatory in terms of like how all of these elements are interdependent. I mean, this and Empty Man are like, in terms of you're studying cultural engineering and religious engineering and how it intersects with technocracy and cultural nihilism and stuff. Like these are like kind of like master keys to understanding it, really.
Yeah, and on the general kind of background nihilisms, the constant onset of the pessimistic radio and everything like that, all these lines, nature never knew colors like that, all the radiation stuff, the general nuclear apocalypse fears, so it's just driving home over and over again, through this Mad Max wasteland, the idea that this is where we're going, it's inevitable, and we deserve it because look how grimy we all are. I mean, this like Depop bill, the sterilization bill is popular, so it's saying it's so hopeless that we'll deserve extinction and we'll recognize it. And like it even kind of mocks Moe's survival of the fittest thing just because it's shown to be so foolish, just because he doesn't survive. He's unable to survive, the violence of the movie. And then on the other hand, we have Jill, who, like Jay, as you were pointing out, the movie, like kind of sympathized with a bit more. And she's talking about how it's sadistic, stupid, and suicidal to have children. So when, again, that's precisely the thing we need to combat elite plans is fortify the family unit and have children and preserve a traditional sense of human meaning. But instead the movie gives us this bad acid trip, philosophy, which is just pretty much the elites want to kill us and there's nothing we can do about it. And don't we kind of deserve it?
Yes. Did you notice, do you think there's a significance to the robot having essentially a US flag basically plastered over his head?
Yeah, I was wondering about that just because like some of this I think is just kind of like just throwing a bunch of political imagery up at the wall, just like forged like to be disorienting, just because like remember like the fact that like Richard Stanley, like he's just like on a lot of acid when he's making this movie. So a lot of this is just bad trip stuff, which includes not just the really visceral like gore and violence, but it includes just this general like deep dystopian pessimism. And so just like probably just the negative association with the American flag might just be part of him going for this kind of techno-fascist dystopian like aesthetic just by putting that on the character.
So not that much thought going into it. Like I was going to ask, is Jill a kind of Pistis Sophia who's basically helping to, create the being that would be the, all Yalda Bayoth by accident? So, a lot of these movies have the theme that if the universe can create a thing like the xenomorph or whatever, that is the ultimate, alpha predator. And if that's the ultimate, end result of the social Darwinism, which I would argue that Ridley Scott's Alien universe is that kind of a thing, where the universe itself is basically evil and an abortion, right? And I mean that Scott and H.R. Giger, basically make that point about what alien signifies, what the xenomorph signifies. So
yeah, I actually had a thought about Giger as kind of relating to this. I mean, sorry, do you have more there? Or
no, just that's what I mean, I'm not trying to press it too hard because I was just speculating, because a lot of times if they are using, archetypal imageries and patterns, they're going to, the female character will be this kind of alchemical completion to the male character, and then she'll kind of give birth to something, or something will be lacking or missing that she completes. So is she a Pistis Sophia who accidentally, kind of gives birth to this thing, or is that pushing it too far? Is it not really that thought out?
I mean, it's genuinely hard to say, but the important thing is that the ideological function is identical regardless of whether that's intentional or not, because again, it's coming out of the same like dystopian pessimistic milieu that is naturally putting these symbols together. So we can't know like Stanley's mind, but either way, there's something similar going on there. And what I was going to say, because you mentioned Giger, is just kind of another example that I would throw in there along with kind of what we already mentioned about like Carolean like chaos magic, about kind of esoterically influenced thought that has to do with hybridity of humanity and technology. And this has to do with kind of the sexual nature of some of what's going on here, which is kind of hinted at by like the gross voyeur character, like the neighbor, like who in all of his gross come-ons to Jill and his spying, and the fact that he was the person who was with this like surveillance company that he like installed the cameras and stuff. Like there's all of that, like really gross voyeuristic sexual component, and then just generally the kind of theme of sexual assault that kind of by the look and feel nature of the robot's attack is just kind of implied throughout. And like what all that made me think of is the kind of creepy eroticism of the idea of human takeover by machines in general, because
the robot has his little like
object,
you could say. Yeah.
Right. That's pretty explicit imagery.
Right.
And, I was going to say it sounds bizarre, but like from the elite occult transhumanist perspective, there is this inherent sexuality to the blend of machinery and the human, just very similar to how they want to destabilize animal human boundaries in like this really perverse way. And like none of that is an exaggeration, because I mentioned some of the dynamics with chaos magic, but then there's also something like the Donna Haraway, like Cyborg Manifesto in academia, or plenty of derivatives of that, where like these discourses of like feminism and posthumanism and animality and hybridity, and sometimes academics will throw in things like disability or whatever into there as well, just are all brought together in this very weaponized posthumanist kind of post-structuralist critical theory stew. So that's another example of a more intentional version of this kind of ideology. I was thinking of the song "We Appreciate Power" by the musician Grimes, Elon Musk's erstwhile lover, and the mother of his child. And she's this explicit transhumanist, communist, feminist, occultist AI worshiper. And those themes are all over her work. But then she explicitly writes a few years ago this techno-fascist AI worship anthem, "We Appreciate Power," which everyone should give it a listen for a really good glimpse into the overall trajectory of the elite program, because she's saying things like, pledge allegiance to the world's most powerful computer, elevate the human race, putting makeup on my face, we appreciate power. That's another example. But then I also thought about Giger, because someone like Giger is deeply influenced by Lovecraft, by Crowley, other occultists like Burroughs, who have post-human or transhuman elements to their work as well. And there's this really intense, creepy eroticism to Giger's artworks that are so often about the intertwining of humanity, of technology,
right.
This really weird, fleshy hybridity of humanity being imprisoned. And like, given Giger's occult influences, there might be some endorsement there, but it's also a very apt image, a warning of this possible nightmare to come. There's a really great article on this subject on Giger by this author, Eric Wargo, I like a lot. Disagree with him about some things, but really influenced by him. At his blog, The Nightshirt, he has an article called "The Passion of the Space Jockey" on Giger and these things about technology that people can look at. So what I think, coming back to hardware with this Richard Stanley film, is a less developed stage of the same theme, because it's not quite the full, because it's nihilistic, it's not quite the full feminist, transhumanist celebration of machine-human eroticism, but it's this earlier stage, this dystopian, really aggressive, masculine recognition that there's something sexual about the subsumption of humanity into technology, but it puts it in terms of extermination rather than the fully developed elite plan of imprisonment within technology, which is where we're going.
Reminds me of Demon Seed. Have you guys seen Demon Seed?
I haven't.
It's a 70s Dean Koontz story that was made into a kind of a goofy British B movie, and the director explicitly said, I wanted to basically merge Dean Koontz and Crowley, because the AI wants to impregnate the woman, Julie Christie, in the film. And so the whole film is basically her trapped in the smart house with the AI trying to like grab her. And I don't know exactly how the bot is going to impregnate her, but that's the theme. And it's all, of course, based on the whole story of, Parsons and all that kind of the Babylon working and all that. And I don't mean to go on too long, but I'll let Brett go in a minute. I did dig up the article, my friend over at True Free Thinker. He found the original interview from 1994, where the director Richard Stanley is talking about his take on Hollywood as a Gnostic empire. So it's from the magazine Kino Kaze in 1994. It's called Report from the Underground. And I'll just read the quote where he goes on for a while talking about this idea of the unknown man in various films. And then he goes on to say, when a child is born, its eyes take a long time to focus, a bit like when you first walk out of a cinema. Going to the cinema, he's saying, is like being born into the world. It is the first thing you see in this dazzling, overexposed white light, which totally is unfocused, and probably one of the first memories that you have when you're born. The light is like when the film starts. Who are you is the question that you ask to the film. No one is sure what the hell the film The Man with No Name is about, or he's talking about the man from High Plains Drifter and Sergio Leone. He says, blah, blah, blah. Basically, he gets into how he's a fan of El Topo and Jodorowsky. And he goes on to say that, you know, for him, Holy Mount was a really meaningful film and blah, 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 which is completely like all the Jodorowsky stuff is just totally Luciferian, which goes without saying. But long story short, he gets to the point where he basically says that he views the cinema not just like a womb, but it's almost like a ritual of going through the process of being born again, being given a new meaning for your life. And I won't read the whole interview, but basically he gets down to the point where he says he was raised as a Catholic military cadet. I think that probably had a lot to do with him being angry at religion, him subsequently rejecting it. And then he goes on to say, the whole point of this is just to say, there's a thing about that I'm exploring in hardware, and it probably gets better explained in Gnostic terms rather than Christianity. In Hitch and Dust Devil, it tries to explain the motives, the dualist heresy in Gnostic terms. The Christian God is, in this idea, the wrong God. He is the usurper God. In Gnostic terms, there is no good or evil. There's only matter and spirit. Matter is inherently evil, and we're constantly trying to strive towards being spirit. And it is the Christian God who created the world in 7 days. And so he's evil for doing that and trapping us in matter. Thus, he goes on to say, basically, there isn't good or evil. There's rather only what, something can be inherently evil. Matter, he says, is inherently evil. And if you think that this is contradictory, then you have not reached the Gnostic enlightenment, which is really the dark amont, he says, which is a kind of dark enlightenment, he's saying in this interview. He goes on to say that really the whole story of Adam and Eve it's flipped in the Gnostic view. The serpent's the good guy. So he basically just ends this interview by saying, yeah, really ultimately a Gnostic Messiah has to come forth with pure energy that would liberate us from the sin of matter. And he says, and this is why for me, Gnosticism is true salvation. So I will add this. It's a fairly lengthy interview from 1994. So I'll put that in the chat below. But there's Richard Stanley himself in 1994 saying that, you know, his goal was the presentation of a Gnostic mythos in this. And I have to give shout out to the Collins brothers. They're actually the one that first told me about this interview and that I should watch Hardware because Stanley, you know, intentionally wanted to be this Gnostic mythos.
I mean, one of the things that tells you, though, is that Stanley is kind of an unreliable witness to his own life. I mean, he says a lot of different things, and I mean, I can't say anything definite, but there's a lot of circumstances, you know, of his life and career which just make you suspect things about his agenda, his source of money. You know, his mother, I guess, was an anthropologist, and he traveled around the world, and he just seemed to find himself in war zones and hotspots a lot of the time. Like, I still can't figure out. He did a documentary called Voice of the Moon, where he was filming the last phase of the Soviet operations in Afghanistan in '89, and he went in with the UN. I mean, I don't know how he got in with I don't know how one gets in with the UN, but he tells these stories that are probably apocryphal, you know, like, you know, I mean, if nothing else, I mean, Dave McGowan has shown us that we probably should be a little bit skeptical of rock and roll magazines, you know, and we should be very skeptical of I mean, like Francis Ford Coppola, for example, great director. I mean, I you know, listen to his audio commentaries. I mean, there's so many contradictions in his own accounts of things that you can't believe what these people say. But there's a lot of suspicious things about you know, about Stanley. And it's interesting that, you know, he views cinema as a form of initiation, essentially, you know, the death, rebirth, and the womb. He views it as a form of initiation, and he's showing you, and he's revealing that to you in the movie. So he worked on music videos, like David Fincher. I mean, he worked well before David Fincher, I think. I mean, he's worked on music videos, including for a band they have a very close relationship with called Fields of Nephilim, which are Lovecraftian, Crowleyan inspired, you know, heavy metal act. And Stanley grew up reading Lovecraft and is deep into all these same interests. But then he makes a movie like Hardware, in which he's showing you the sort of toxic, you know, destabilizing effects of the sort of psychically destructive effects of the very culture which he is creating, and he's showing it to you. And you just have to wonder, like, what is the I mean, what is the aesthetic value of something like this? Like, what is he after? And I mean, listening to him talk, he's not very clear about it. I mean, you know, he seemed to have, you know, he was using a lot of drugs and having a lot of bad trips, and he wanted to translate these bad trips. Like he was being he was sort of, I would say he was self-traumatizing himself with drugs and media.
Okay.
And then he was trying to do that on a mass scale and reproduce that experience on a mass scale, which in his case happens to be a very interesting window, you know, into this phase of cultural nihilism.
Well, but I mean, that's the thing, right? Like, isn't it interesting? I know I point this out ad nauseum, but I mean, so many people who go down the hallucinogenic route, they just always end up in some kind of Gnostic or monistic or dualistic kind of worldview. Why is that? Why do they always end up in these kinds of positions? Unless they happen to have, like, you know, a situation where they felt like, you know, they were seeing demons and then they run to the nearest church, as some people do. I'm not knocking anybody or pointing out anybody specific. I'm speaking of, you know, people that we know that have converted recently have had those kinds of experiences. But why is it that if the universe is nihilistic, why do we see these patterns? There wouldn't really be patterns at all, right? There would be chaos. There wouldn't be meaning at all. I mean, it's just part of like tag, right? You can't have meaning at all without some notion of objective meaning. So in the same way, you can't have patterns even in pagan religions across the world if there weren't realities to these patterns in some way.
Right. Well, in that kind of psychedelic and bad trip experience, or or delusional trip experience, like you get a microcosm of these broader dynamics of deconstruction and reconstruction. Because you have on like the one hand, there's like, you know, the dissolution of all these categories and these kind of like ideas, these very chaotic, like, you know, like muddled metaphysics that come out of these experiences. But then you also just like constantly have these kind of ideas about gnosis, about, you know, about divine enlightenment, about divinization, about apotheosis. And so these, you know, these trips kind of like get people just like on in a very immediate sense, where the cultural psyop is taking us overall, which is just like destroying all the defenses we have against these ideas in order to reconstruct a new spirituality that has to do with again, humanity becoming God, or the worship of entities, or mediumship, or all these things. And so Gnosticism is basically a convenient bridge from one to the other. It's kind of an ideological software by which people can make sense of chaotic experiences, but really the point is just to destroy old categories, to destroy defenses, to make room for new categories.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, maybe I have a tendency to over analyze and look for things that aren't really intended to have a connected, coherent significance. And like you said, really, it's just there to do kind of cultural bulldozing.
Yeah, and it's just interesting, like with someone like Stanley, who like on one hand throughout this movie is showing us genuine truths about you know, plans for depopulation and some of the worst aspects of the elite agenda, but you just see this pattern come up over and over again with certain segments of people into psychedelia or certain forms of occultism who are also into conspiratorial stuff, where they'll decry the elites on, you know, like all day long on one hand, or they'll have the sense that something's terribly wrong, but they just can't help at the end of the day but recapitulate the exact kind of elite esoteric or Gnostic spirituality that they're supposedly railing against, just because or should be trying to escape, just because they don't have the ideological, religious, philosophical foundations to get out of these base level traps. So they end up recapitulating exactly what on the surface they're saying that they're fighting against.
Yeah, and people can be swayed from one week to the next, right? I mean, he could have been, you know, tripping and feeling like one week he was a Gnostic, and then maybe 3 weeks later he's like, nah, man, I'm just an atheist, right? I mean, who knows what, you know, where he might have flipped back and forth. But anything to conclude? I don't have much more in my notes on hardware. Brett, anything you want to throw in on hardware?
Yeah, I mean, we should say too, especially on this podcast, that there's some more or less explicitly like satanic elements to it when Jill is hacking into the program using the bail access code, right? And she hacks into the program. At the center of the programming is a pentagram, which is interesting because it's downward, or no, it's upward pointing. Like you think of the Metropolis pentagram, which gives us the same sort of association between whatever Satanism, Luciferianism, technology, transhumanism, and so you see that same constellation of tropes here. But what else? Well, I mean, it's reborn on Christmas. This is some kind of inversion, right? right?
I forgot the
of
Christmas
the birth of
element.
Christ. So, and this is sort of the, I mean, there is apotheosis here, right? So yeah, that Gnostic religion of apotheosis is implied here, but the God is the death bot. I mean, it's going to destroy humanity.
That's why we keep seeing Kali, right?
Yeah.
Oh, right. The debt, right. So, and the other thing I do want to point out that maybe you have an explanation for this. So when Shades is having that trip, when he's having his drug trip, if you remember, he starts hallucinating what looks to me to be a monarch butterfly, right? I mean, is this sort of a monarch wink? Because and he's sort of beside himself with this psychedelic mania, euphoria, and he says it's so fucking beautiful. In between a Hunter S. Thompson reference, right? My heart feels like an alligator. But yeah, what is going on with the monarch butterfly there?
Again, I would just be speculating because I'm don't know that he would have known that much about these kinds of programs, but the Monarch program itself was one of the intersects to MK Ultra. To transhumanism. So, I mean, I'm sure you guys know, but a lot of people don't know that MK Ultra does have a transhumanist component, because what happens is it immediately goes out of the drug stuff and into the DARPA, biometric stuff. So they want to start looking at adapting humans, and that was MK Search and MK Delta. So this is where we get the stories of the super soldiers, which really was, not just the messing with the brain chemistry and the psyche through the drugs, but actually then changing man himself through the implementation of various technologies. So for example, if you read what's his name, Lilly was big on this, like that the technology would be the key that would actually transform man, not really the drugs, the LSD. It would be implanting the tech. So but they go together, because Lilly, for example, who again, I think he was lying, you can't trust everything that John C. Lilly says, but he was one of the people who would actually say, when I go into the float tank, when I'm tripping, when I interact with the entities, they're the ones giving me the ideas for the tech. And he was one of the first pioneers of putting the chips into people and into the dolphins. So that's speculating. I mean, again, I don't know that Richard Stanley is that sophisticated in it, but there is a direct connection between MK Ultra and transhumanism. Absolutely.
Well, I do know that Richard Stanley says that he channeled one of his movies, or a short that's in an anthology called Mother of Toads, from a Ouija board. A voice spoke to him through, yes. So he has said that, but I'm not making the accusations, but you look at his background, you just couldn't rule out that the guy is involved in intelligence, because he actually bothers to deny it. I mean, like he's like, why he didn't go back to Afghanistan, he tells it, well, because it would look like I'm an intelligence agent. Yeah, it already looks like you're an intelligence agent. Like, yeah. I don't know, but he's at least admitting to this interviewer.
Well, that's kind of what the Collins brothers kind of hinted that might be the case when they analyzed Stanley. So yeah, that makes sense.
And he's got that profile, like he's just got that picaresque sort of E. Howard Hunt sort of feel to him. He thinks he's James Bond, and but that's all I have for him.
Thomas, anything else?
Yeah, just a couple quick notes on the movie before we move on. I think that the image at the very end of the scavenger that we see at the beginning of the movie, I think that's important, because he's just kind of going on his way, not touched by the chaos and violence of the movie. So like the only character who's kind of like above it all, not really touched by what's going on here, is this guy who has like no connections other than for his own survival. So I think that that's part of kind of just like really punching in the just the nihilism of the movie, is that this guy who's completely a loner is the only one who comes off like looking somewhat shiny by the end of it.
That's the lead singer of Bands of the Nephilim, the Zone Tripper guy. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So another hint that there's kind of like a positive thing about that character from the film's perspective, that he's a cool guy. So you have that. I thought that the fact that Shades is kind of tripping and kind of useless like when they most need him was kind of a poignant counterpart to like Moe's like psychedelic experience right before that, like he gets killed. It's just like showing like how these drugs leave us docile, like when the enemy's at our doorstep, when anti-human machinery is here to kill us, then if you're the psychedelic trip is just like basically leaving you completely vulnerable. So I thought about that. And just the scene with like kind of like the gross neighbor in general. Just also it's just interesting how like those scenes kind of like implicate the audience in that type of perversion, where this guy's supposed to be like really gross and off-putting and all these things, but just by virtue of like having the scene where he's like spying on them while they're having sex and stuff like that, and narrating in this really graphic, gross way, the audience is being put in that same position of like voyeurism and perversion. Just part of the movie's overall nihilism is kind of like putting you in that space. So.
Well, I mean, the thing about that is like he's watching through this really blurry heat lamp, and I'm just thinking, like, wouldn't they have had like really sophisticated, at least PRON pornography at this time, right? If they really wanted to, like, that's what it's funny that he's watching like the worst quality, imagery, given this supposed, given this dystopian world with, anyway. We did have a couple super chats that I would add because they put them in before we had to shut down the tech issues. Greenfeather says for $30, Jay, I would really like to have you on my podcast for a chance to discuss the transition from Rome to Orthodoxy and some of the specifics and metaphysics and apologetics. If I can send you an email, let me know. Yeah, sure, I'd be glad to come on. Green Feathers, much appreciated. Palantir says for $3, Jay, I noticed that the Orthodox Study Bible from Thomas Nelson uses different words than Bibles like the KJV for Zechariah 12:10. So that's because the Orthodox Study Bible is in many places using the New King James and not always the King James. And I don't actually know the history of the specific text that the KJV uses for the Old Testament. I know that it was supposed to be the received text, but it may be because the Orthodox Study Bible is actually going to the Septuagint. So that might be why there's differences for, you said Zechariah 12:10, mocked instead of pierced. Yes, that is because the Septuagint. I don't think it relates to the Masoretic text because I don't think the KJV was using the Masoretic text. But I could be wrong about that. But good question. Palantir again, $3. Can you offer advice for some? I'm not really an advice person, but I ordered the Orthodox Study Bible, but I'm worried about accidentally doing eisegesis. Well, just follow the notes, right? I mean, you're not gonna accidentally, fall into eisegesis if you're careful about not, reading your own meaning into the text. What approach do you recommend? Again, just consistently trying to read it with the mind of the church fathers, go to Chrysostom's commentaries, go to, Augustine has a lot of commentaries, sermons that are really good for exegeting the text. Those are good ways to not go out of the bounds of orthodoxy. Apart from your videos, what are reliable online lectures about exegesis, book by book? Again, I don't know about online lectures of exegesis, but you can always just go to the church fathers. There's actually an app called Katina, which has most of the church fathers' commentaries on scripture in the app. So get the Katina app. That'd be a good way to go with that. All right. So as we move on, are we cool to do maybe La Femme Nikita next? Mm-hmm. And this is the 1990 espionage thriller from Luc Besson. Luc Besson is a hit and miss director, and unfortunately there is quite a bit of propaganda in Luc Besson films, especially more recent ridiculous things like Lucy. Lucy was one of the stupidest films I've ever seen, a preposterous transhumanist film. But as I mentioned a minute ago, there's not too much of a leap to go from the realm of MK Ultra to transhumanism. There's a direct connection there. So I don't at all find it strange that so many directors and people who talk about transhumanism also have elements of MK Ultra. So if you want to read more on that, you can read the Walter Boert book, which goes into that. There's a whole chapter on how MK Ultra gives way to transhumanism via DARPA, via implantable microchips, etc. The last chapter of John Marx's book, multiple chapters in Annie Jacobson's book on DARPA get into this. I think she even has a section on MK Ultra in that book. But so we will notice that even though it may seem disconnected, the patterns and principles that you notice in mind control relate directly to robotics. For example, as Catherine Austin Fitts often says, the goal is to make humans more robotic and to make robots more human. And that has to do with where they're taking us into this synthesis between man and machine, man and bot. And I'll just start off my notes on Femme Nikita by pointing out that there is the point that even the Wikipedia description notes that Nikita is essentially a nihilist. I mean, even the Wikipedia writers could notice this. And so once again, we have this theme of nihilism and hopelessness that gives way to being reborn. But in the case of Nikita, she's not reborn into Christianity or true religion, so to speak. She's reborn into being an assassin, an agent, a mind-controlled operative of the state. And in this case, it is the French intelligence service, where she basically, if you've not seen the film, I'm going to summarize just real briefly, is that she's basically taken off the street as a junkie after killing a cop, and she's given her death is staged, and then she's put into this secret underground base where she is trained for 4 years to become a super spy, sex operative, swallow assassin, and she goes on to do it very effectively. And the just sort of from the out of the gates analysis is that, isn't it interesting that they take a girl who has basically no qualms about it, she's like a wild beast, and then she's then, as this nihilistic creature, the perfect silly putty to be molded into the assassin sex operative. I'll let you guys take it from there. And what do you think about La Femme Nikita?
Yeah, well, I think the really key line there is when we are told that there's no limits to two things, to femininity and the means of taking advantage of it. And so that line from one of the people like training Nikita like gives away what the movie is up to, because it's about this character of Nikita seducing the audience, kind of like all these other characters in the movie are becoming fixated on her. And it would be like a much clunkier form of culture engineering if it was just straightforwardly a movie about, like, there's this agency called the Center and it's so awesome, and like we love what these spies are doing there, and obviously elites are capable of producing like that kind of really obvious propaganda. But at least here Besson is up to something a little bit trickier, a little bit more sophisticated. But the important thing, I think, is that the film really worships this character and is trying to bring the audience into that mindset, which is why we see her in all of these different modes. She's a competent assassin, she's a promising skilled agent in training, just kind of doing her best, she's a vulnerable woman in a tragic situation, she's a violent murderer, she's somebody who's hopelessly in love with this guy, she's sophisticated, she's slovenly, she's good, she's evil. She's basically here as a character, I think, just to activate every possible signal of what could get people invested in any angle of her femininity that it takes, just like the other characters get fixated on her. Because I think we're supposed to subliminally take away that the program that she's put through, it works. She does get rehabilitated. Her life is redeemed through her time with this agency. She learns this whole like litany of skills that she's told with toward the beginning, learn to read, to talk, to think. And she gets to basically do that and then move on, even though there's, of course, no happy ending to the real life version of the story. Marco presents Bob like these embassy documents to get her out of any of the trouble that she's in. But that obviously wouldn't do anything. In real life, she would be hunted down and killed or worse or whatever. So the takeaway here is that the Center plays a positive role in her life. There's kind of a critique of it in the movie, but it's really toothless. Even what Marco, the fiance character, says to Bob, that he says that, he's a hypocrite for judging her and exploiting the fact that she killed this policeman. But like this character, the fiance, he's also explicitly absolved Nikita for all of her crimes that she's committed. Her killing people is fine with him because it suits him, because she seduced him so entirely. He's in love with her, so he has no qualms with being in love with this deep state murderer. And that character, the fiance, is this totally audience sympathetic character. Like she tells him, "You're the most beautiful person I've ever met," and he's supposed to be this model of love and forgiveness. So what I think is going on is that through his love for the Nikita, the audience is getting permission to love her as well, and thus absolve her of all of her crimes that she commits as a spy, as an assassin.
Yeah, I want to go back. You made a really interesting observation. I made a note. I mean, the way it's glamorizing the lifestyle, right? The programmed super slave operative, spy. So many of the so much of the so many of the sort of mind controlled, monarch movies or whatever you want to call, like so much of this type of cinema, like usually like with like Sucker Punch and some other ones, they're fetishizing like the internal world of the mind controlled slave. Now this movie is fetishizing like the external like world, the flashy, and it's just makes me think like in a way how skillful Besson is as a director, because like some of his early films were lumped in with I guess a couple other French directors. They called like the cinema du look, which is kind of a pejorative description. It was like kind of style over substance. It's kind of like pre-Tarantino kind of elements to it, and always the romantic element, which you see in so many like Tarantino scripts, a true romance and stuff. But so that works right here, like what, and then the way that Thomas was explaining, to kind of like overcome these weird moral qualms of the audience. But yeah, it's definitely trying to get the audience in the spirit of being a mind controlled super operative.
Yeah, he just a couple of side notes about him too. He seems to have this fixation throughout the films that he does with not just the female assassin, but ultimately as a kind of goddess. I mean, he is a revolutionary, I would say. I mean, the notion, the consistent patterns in his films present him as someone who is a revolutionary. I mean, in the sense that the feminine is superior to the masculine. If you think about Fifth Element, right, he has Mila Jovovich as essentially the incarnation of the feminine principle. She's basically the incarnation of the ether, the highest of the elements, as Lilu. In movies like The Messenger, he has Mila Jovovich as Joan of Arc, who essentially is just this marauding and crusading killer who we never even know if she actually is hearing Jesus talk or not. So it's like the film, it has Joan of Arc is basically a lunatic, but as a feminist hero and archetype at the same time. And if I remember, he was married to or dated Mila Jovovich for a while back at that time. And there's a curious parallel with the fact that like a huge portion of her roles have her as someone playing an MK Ultra monarch type assassin or sex operative, etc. She literally plays that role like countless times, and not even in films where she's like playing something more akin to a dramatic role. She is someone who is either traumatized or undergoing some sort of mind control trauma. There's one where she can't see faces. It's kind of a dysphoria. I forget the name of it, but it has
faces in the crowd.
That's it. Yeah, and that was studied as part of MK Ultra 2, that disorder, which is just a tangential connection. But I mean, and then after his time with her, he goes on to, I think, then he married or dated the chick from the alien chick that sings in Fifth Element, the one that has that weird.
So it's the other way. The alien chick he was involved with her when she was 14 or 15, and then she was pregnant when she was. But I mean, it's complicated, and he's been accused of rape. I mean, since then, and I mean, yeah. So he left her on the set of the Fifth Element for Mila Jovovich.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
I had it backwards. Thanks. Yeah, and then more recent films like we have like Colombiana, same theme, female assassin. Anna, very much mind control sex operative. It's basically just a representation of this movie, but in a more sleeker 2021 situation where she's basically a bisexual lesbian assassin who dupes both the KGB and the CIA and goes on this rampage. All the same monarch themes, right? Alternate personalities, blah 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 blah. So this is like a huge this is this dude's career is basically goddess, sex operative, mind control, and as I said, Lucy, right, which is like total Luciferianism. It's the first monkey that was supposedly the Lucy monkey, and then now it's they've renamed the Scarlett Johansson instantiation of the goddess basically as the AI that will be the new self-conscious AI that takes over the world or whatever, with the black goo. So I mean, I think we're dealing with somebody who's like totally 100% part of the transhumanist Luciferian satanic system, like, and he believes it.
Right. And on the kind of revolutionary goddess worship angle, like in this movie, there's kind of like an occult dynamic of psychological engineering going on here that's subtle, but I think pretty noticeable once you see it, which, starts with basically noticing that this is not a redemption story about her leaving the spy world to have a normal life and marry Marco. She leaves them both. So she transcends both these options. She escapes them to pursue
as does Anna. Anna does the exact same thing.
Right, absolutely. And so basically she's this ultimate secret agent. She embraces total anonymity, total boundlessness. And the image at the end of the movie of these two men who love her sitting across from the table from each other, saying about how much they'll miss her, they represent these two poles of her life: normalcy on one hand, and this fantastic but traumatizing life of being a spy on the other. And that image is really key, I think, to understanding what's going on here, because this split within her identity is her power. And this is all, I think, serving a couple of functions. One is disguising a doubling down as a both ands, and something to think about in general is how elite ideology loves to dodge charges against it by appealing to fallacious both ands. It's like on the religious level, like the syncretism. It's like, oh, you just have this one ideology, but we have both your ideology and all the ideologies. This very malign meta paradigm. But here it's it's not that she's a spy. She's both normal and a spy. And it's like, yeah, dude, that's called being a spy, right? I mean, the trauma-based mind control is all about psychic splitting, and elite occultists are always obsessed with twin imagery. So it's the real darkness of doubling and of splitting. So it's this dialectics of alchemy and the combination of opposites. And I don't think it's overwrought to bring in all of that specific occult or esoteric language into analyzing, even as a simple espionage thriller, because that's what espionage is. It's what cultural engineering is. Like the techniques that they use are a form of sorcery. The spiritual, resonant descendants, in some cases, direct ideological lineage descendants of older forms of magical programming and manipulation. And I think there's something like that going on very strongly with this character in this.
Well, yeah, I mean, just think about Aquino wrote a whole book called Black Magic, where he essentially went to the ancient world's view, especially ancient Egypt, the way that they viewed sorcery. He tried to take those principles and imbue them into his doctrine of psychological warfare for the army, right? That he co-wrote that. Not the Black Magic. The Black Magic document informs the essay that he wrote with the other lieutenant colonel, My War to Psy War. But if both books basically, or the Black Magic book basically does this very thing, is that it attempts to take from the ancient sorcery world and implement that into today's intelligence operations. And some even allege that Aquino may have been involved in the Monarch program at some point. So very plausible. At least the people who make those allegations have plausible reasons why that could be. But I don't know if that is confirmed. But what that shows is that you're absolutely right that there's not as much of a disparate connection that between these two worlds as you might think. I mean, literally, sorcery and alchemy relate 100% directly to intelligence operations, spycraft, for sure.
Yeah, completely directly. And Aquino is maybe the best example of that, or definitely way up there, but there are others as well. Just a note about a very specific scene in the movie that I think drives this theme of kind of psychic splitting home, like the scene where she's in Venice pretending to take a bath when she's actually getting ready to snipe somebody. And Marco's outside the door and he's like trying to have this heartfelt conversation with her. This is this really poignant scene, and some really good shots, because it's very convincing in getting the audience both to genuinely really feel for him, trying to communicate with her and care for her and express sympathy for her. And we're also supposed to want her to successfully complete her mission, kill the person and hide the gun. So like this, getting the odds to split the audience, like sympathy like that for an outcome in a scene, that's the exact kind of thing that might seem innocuous, but has like connections to these occult dynamics that we're talking about in terms of manipulating the psyche. And so that's the kind of thing that we all need to be looking out for when we're watching just like even seemingly innocuous scenes like that.
Yeah, that's a pretty good analysis of the MPD DID, angle of the film. I mean, the only thing that really kind of tipped me off about it is, of course, in the last operation involves, not just a sort of body double and her pretend. I mean, like, how is she supposed to convincingly pretend to be this? I mean, that bespeaks like some kind of extreme skill and like mimicking other people. So I mean that, and well, you know, who else you know, benefits from doing that? Well, you know, if you have that skill, you can be an actor, right, as well. So that's where the Hollywood angle comes in, is they're kind of tipping you off. That's a little bit of revelation of the method. They're sort of tipping you off, you know, to that. But interesting what you make of the fact that she, which I think, yeah, is really a kind of dissociative power trip, that she escapes and gets away, because in The Point of No Return, they go for the like Hollywood romance, you know, angle, which
it's awful.
You don't like. I like Point of No Return.
Really?
I actually did kind of like it. I don't like the ending, but no, I didn't mind the film. I'd point out also, like, in terms of her programming, it's very elliptical, right? They only show us certain things. I think we're supposed to make much of what they're showing us. She's being drugged. She's perhaps, you know, being hypnotized in certain ways. But what's interesting is the music, is they let her basically cover her walls with the kind of MTV culture of the day. And there's also this graffiti, some of which is, I mean, a lot of it, if you pause it, I mean, a lot of it's just very, just kind of like, you know, it's like bathroom, kind of like sexualized bathroom graffiti, and some stuff is like snake and sex. And so there's some sort of sexual, erotic element to this rock and roll culture. And it's also, so they make a point of like, it's very similar in Point of No Return, that she's into like what is it, Nina Simone, and she insists on having this music. So I think there's other movies this time. I mean, you mentioned, you brought up No Place to Hide. I don't know if that was on my recommendation that you checked out No Place to Hide, which you talked about, you know, recently. But there's a scene in that too where they make a point of showing how this traumatized person is listening to music with lyrics that kind of allude to mind control. Then you think of like, I think too of like Cape Fear, and the way she's like watching him. There's just a lot of this at this period of time. And so it makes you think that are they suggesting that kind of musical culture is, by its nature, or can be used as a form of programming, you know?
Oh,
so
wow.
from
Yeah, that's a great point. I wonder too that it's interesting that most people in the culture at that time didn't have any conception of anything Jeff Stein Effrey like. And yet we have this sort of Ghislaine Maxwell style character who comes in as this older, you know, government employee madam, basically, who trains her in the ways of being seductive. And I mean, even this isn't an extremely explicit movie, but the implication is that they are giving her sex kitten programming and training. She's learning to be basically a whore for the state. And that's really part of the role of some of these people, is to undergo this. And this is a real thing. This really does exist. There are real courses where people are trained in this to be sex operatives for the state. Most governments do it. It's not, it may not be known, widely known, but it's always existed, basically. I mean, this is one of the two oldest professions, are not mutually exclusive, by the way, the prostitute and the spy. Sometimes it can be both. And a lot of films have portrayed that in recent years, but this one is just unique in that I can't think of any. I mean, there's a few old spy movies that hint. You know, we have Cary Grant being a raven in Notorious, where he entraps the Ingrid Bergman character. And I'm sure there's a few, you know, Bond movies that have, you know, the obvious Bond himself is, I guess, kind of a raven. He's a sex operative, you could argue. But to have an explicit sort of government agent who is training the up and coming government agent in being a sex entrapment operative is just kind of surprising to me. Just, it's like, you know, when we see the Jeff Stein Effrey news come out and everybody's like, oh, wow, you know, they were entrapping people. And it's like, dude, this has gone on for forever. Oh, by the way, here's this movie that has it right here. It's like, why are we surprised when we see the Jeff Stein Effrey stuff come out, when like Luc Besson is telling you right here, Revelation of the Method, this is what the system does.
Yeah, they're really, in Point of No Return, I mean, they're even more explicit about the sex kitten, you know, angle of the programming. But I mean, I don't think you can talk about this issue without bringing up Leon, or The Professional, film he made a few years later,
Oh,
which
that's
is
right. I forgot about the press. Yeah.
he's even better. I mean, that is like, I mean, how do you say it? I mean, it's like a PEDO seduction fantasy. And he was actually, and by the way, his ex-wife said that he was writing it basically about his relationship with her when she was a teenager.
Oh, wow.
And Bassan will explain the origin of the movie where, I mean, it's a spin-off of the Femme Nikita. It's the cleaner character, the Renault cleaner character. And he just had to make a movie about him. And he said, oh, I just thought of like different scenarios. It could be an old person or a bird or different things. And obviously he's just lying, right? He knew this, he was using this as a vehicle for that kind of thing. And I mean, so yeah, I think and so she's this in professional, it's Natalie Portman who shows up in a lot of these sort of mind control trauma, roles. And it's Natalie Portman, and she's a little girl that's coming from this like really messed up, traumatized background, and she escapes and is living with this 45-year-old assassin and trying to seduce him, and he's training her to be an assassin.
Don't forget, by the way, as you said, right, Natalie Portman undergoes V's literal mind control trauma processing in V for Vendetta.
V for Vendetta, right? So
good point.
So yeah, I mean, I don't know, there's very subtle, I mean, I'm starting to notice, like in No Place to Hide, for example, it's not inconsequential. I talk about this on my episode on that, our bonus episode, about the fact that it's the ballerina, who's killed, because ballerinas come up a lot, whether in music boxes or as ballerinas, right. They come up a lot. And if you do research into ballerinas, you'll see that, in the Paris Ballet, for example, in the late 19th, early 20th century, I mean, ballerinas were kind of bought and sold by these patricians who funded the ballet.
Have you seen Red Sparrow?
No, I mean, I know that, yeah, I mean, I need to watch that, and of course Black Widow, and it's the same stuff, exactly. Right? But they were put through this very militaristic, it's described to me as a very militaristic style training at the same time. So I mean, maybe if you look, I don't know, maybe if somebody researches, they find they were using them as spies as well. Who knows?
I mean, that's what's implied in Red Sparrow, is that supposedly this was like Stalin's way of recruiting and bringing orphaned girls and people like that into this Soviet espionage program, which, I mean, I've read, I think that's probably real. But the thing about Red Sparrow is that it makes it like, oh, that's what the KGB did, and we as the CIA, we saved the people from that, which, I mean, come on, nobody believes that.
Stalin was using ballerinas as spies.
I don't know specifically about a ballerina, but I'm saying that he had a program where he would take in prostitutes and orphans that had potential, and then they would put them all through all kinds of different rigorous training. And I think it's very plausible that there could be ballerinas, because supposedly Olga Chekova, who was like the biggest Russian actress of that time, was a spy for Stalin. So I'm just saying most likely that I'm sure there were ballerinas that were used.
Well, you see that in The Dark Knight, right? Remember he himself uses the cover of a ballet of the is it the ballet, right? To get to Hong Kong, right? So you've seen that in movies before, ballet being used for spy operations as well. I mean, there's also, what is at the end of the movie, the mention of the video cassettes in the final scene? Is there some kind of PRON blackmail? I didn't really get that. But remember that there's a discussion between her handler and the boyfriend, and he asked me, well, do you have the video cassettes? Or I mean, what is that referring to?
Is that what she was trying to get out of the embassy?
Okay, okay, I didn't get the.
So I think you're right, though. I think it had to do with it was something that she was trying to get out of the embassy that had to do with high level blackmail, I think.
Okay.
So
yeah, there's a blackmail element. That's what I'd written down. Yeah. I mean, also in the programming, I mean, there's a kind of use of psychological terror and trauma. When he tells her that'll clip your wings, and I mean, they use a lot of brutal, sort of methods there that are, perhaps being used to depattern and reprogram. But again, it's sort of elliptical, and it doesn't show you too much. It's just like, I mean, what is it, like 10 years or something pass, like a long period of time passes while she's in captivity. We see a series of scenes.
Right. On that, like, I just think it's really striking that we're supposed to kind of be given this rather positive understanding in the movie of her handler, of Bob, even though he puts her in this position of almost getting her killed in her, your final training exercise in her first mission, with the window being bricked up, and she's like screaming at him. He's saying, "Oh, of course it was." And like toward the end with the Victor the cleaner character, we get the idea of like, oh, this is too much, this is too far. But it's all makes someone like her handler look somewhat reasonable by comparison. He's like stable and cares about her, and oh, she passed the test and she didn't get killed, good for her. When reality, of course, like that is a form of trauma and trauma-based mind control, even because it's not just teaching her survival skills, but it's messing with her mind through messing with her sense of trust, which is ultimately messing with her sense of reality. So just the fact that handler character is largely coded as positive shows that there's something, I think, pretty bleak going on here. And like also very similarly in the scene when he comes to dinner as her uncle to meet her fiance, and how he's just so ready instinctually to conjure up all these hyper specific adorable images of her as a child, who her fiance apparently has this emotionally intimate relationship with her, but he's ready to wholesale believe all of it. And it's even affecting kind of to listen to as the audience, that like, oh, just like, yeah, she'd pretend to be a frog when she was a little girl or whatever, even though we know that he's lying. So it's a dead giveaway that the audience fixation on Nikita is something manipulative and manufactured, because like a lot of these movies, it tells you that it's manipulating you while it's doing it. Like it's telling you, oh, she's this fascinating, mysterious creature of pure, fierce, multi-layered femininity, when the movie shows you exactly what she is, a victim, this tragic, violent junkie being utilized by the deep state, to accomplish violent ends.
Is there an element that the state actually can save you? The state is a kind of, because at the beginning, the first thing that we see is them walking towards, it's called Club Caduceus, right? And the Caduceus, of course, is like the hospital. So we know that there's going to be a change. I mean, it's a kind of a monarch in the sense of like the transformation process, right? So the character's going to undergo a change. Is this saying basically that the state is a savior, or is it that you're your own savior? Because just like Anna, none of these states actually save her, right? I mean, they basically become the vehicles for the main character to transcend all the limitations and boundaries and basically be the ultimate version of anarcho-libertarianism, basically.
Right. Yeah, I think it's both those things, just precisely. It's the one through the other. It's this very explicit message of you're your own savior, with the implicit message of, they rehabilitated her, the state saved her. Like that's, kind of what I mean with just like the movie's up something very tricky in terms of its cultural engineering, in that like it's not this like full frontal endorsement of the state. What it is it's like subtly showing you that this character that you're supposed to worship and be fixated on had this positive experience where she learned her lessons and she got out. And like that's kind of like what's going on, I think, with the in terms of like the positive and negative impressions of the spy agency in the movie, with the cleaner character, is basically like a foil there for the audience to project all of your negative impressions of espionage onto this one character who's like maybe cool but obviously insane, whereas the other spies are sympathetic or reasonable or at least competent. So it's just like, oh, it's too bad that there's this one maniac here who's killing people left and right. He's crazy and obsessed with the mission, and it's like pouring acid on a guy who's still alive, when really like all of these spies are murderers. And like Victor the Cleaner is called in by the same people who have been running the show the whole time. He's just like this cog in this like state program that we've been tacitly rooting for the whole movie through our sympathy to Nikita. So that character, I think, is this cop out, this easy way out, this catalyst for Nikita to transcend her normalcy espionage binary and be her own savior, since this one guy supposedly goes too far with his whole "I don't stop missions in progress," and her screaming, "Please, I can't take this," when we've been past any reasonable moral limit like this whole movie. So like her distress kind of rings hollow. It's all just an excuse for her kind of like to like I said, transcend the espionage normalcy binary, which is just an endorsement of espionage.
Right. Is it also an attitude of the elite that this is a person from the lowest realm of society, like, in other words, from the elite perspective, the junkie who could basically overcome morals and taboos to become the Ubermensch who's willing to kill at will and feels no compunction. I mean, that's what the elite like. That's the kind of person, because the elite themselves see themselves as sort of Ubermensch killers. So they fetishize, they like the person who's willing to sacrifice humans. The only difference is that the elite themselves do it through proxies, through, very powerful, wealthy decision-making processes, as opposed to, the assassin who just completes the government mission. But the point is rather that, I mean, they're just basically lionizing the killer as the hero. I mean, and the killer, I'm not saying there's not a legitimate place in warfare and self-defense for doing that kind of a thing, but the apotheosis of the killer is really just another element of, worshiping the angel who came to steal, kill, and destroy, who is Satan.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I think it's an elite power fantasy. It's for them to
there you go.
project this idea of this goddess who comes from nowhere and creates herself and saves herself and is violent and seductive and all these things.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
It's almost like some form, you call it like spiritual Darwinism, right? That we create a great toxic culture so that the one of the mutants, most of them will be radiated, but one of them will get superpowers. I mean, isn't that just a metaphor for trauma-based, sort of programming in general?
Yeah.
But you notice the Masonic checkerboard floors, the training. So this is some sort of initiatory process. There's a lot of things that are signaling that. But yeah, you guys have really read a lot out of it. You've gotten a lot. You've gotten a lot out of this film, especially. I mean, it's easier when you look at it in the context of going from Lucy back, looking at Besson's other films, like Jay said, this goddess archetype that keeps getting recycled. What does she think? If she's in prison and she's getting drugged and they're going to fake her death, I mean, does she know that they're like illegally killing her with an overdose of tranquilizers? Or I mean, it's not like in Point of No Return, like she's being executed, I think. But in this movie, they're just supposed to be subduing her, and it's supposed to look like an accident. Or, I mean, I gather that's what it is. This is a very similar scenario in a film called Control from, I think, 2002.
You mentioned that, and I forgot to watch it. I think
it's by Tim Hunter, who is someone you'll flag quite a bit on the did Twin Peaks episodes and is in a handful of things that are kind of monarch stuff. But in that movie it's Ray Liotta who signs on where we're going to.
I wrote this down. Yeah, I saw the trailer. Yeah.
And Willem Dafoe's the good programmer, and Willem Dafoe, we see that formula here a lot. The good guy programmer who, nonetheless, especially nonetheless, does traumatic things. I mean, so the suicide mission as a test is something that right after he's gained her trust is something that would be immediately traumatizing. And you can compare that to other films that have that same kind of suicide test scenario, like Tenet, for example, the Nolan film that just came out. Like that's some part of to be a super spy, you have to pass the suicide test.
Yeah.
But that's about all. I mean, I don't have a ton more on. I want to say too, the cleaner. Back to the cleaner thing. One more thing. I'm watching this Femme Nikita. I'm like, the genre of the cleaner. Like this has got to be the inspiration, right, for Harvey Keitel's Winston Wolfe and Pulp Fiction. Then I rewatched Point of No Return, which I'd only seen like when I was a teenager. Like back in the '90s. I'm like, oh, of course. Well, Harvey Keitel plays the Jean Reno character in Point of No Return, which must then have. Which must have been the inspiration, although when does Tarantino say he wrote that? So this character must have had something to do with inspiring the Winston Wolfe character, or there's a bunch of synchronicities going on. But in Pulp Fiction, it's the kind of lighthearted take on on much heavier material in Femme Nikita.
Yeah, I mean, great points, and lot of parallels, as we said, to more recent regurgitations of this, especially Black Widow and Red Sparrow. I did a couple notes on that, and one interesting thing about Black Widow that I didn't expect was at the beginning we see the Scarlett Johansson character Black Widow when she's young and she's an orphan and she's taken into human trafficking, which was pretty wild to see that in a major Marvel film at the very beginning. And ironically, it's Mila Jovovich's daughter that plays the young Scarlett Johansson put into. So when she's put into this thing, she's given over to this handler who trains the ballerinas to be basically MK Ultra assassin, sex spies. And Black Widow, the premise of the whole movie is just basically not just her origin story, but basically they're rising up against their Bond villain handler who's programmed them, basically. So that's the whole plot of the movie. But as a side note, it actually includes alteration of your DNA and your brain chemistry through certain chemicals and nanotech, which is pretty wild, especially things that are happening nowadays. But yeah, that was all in Black Widow, and totally didn't expect any of that to be there. But Red Sparrow, pretty self-evident. I mean, it's kind of the same theme. She's actually put into the I think it's Stalin's, is it Stalin or I can't remember if it takes place in the 80s, and I think it takes place in the close of the Cold War, if I remember, in Red Sparrow. So it's still KGB era, but she's put into the ballerina as her, into the Moscow whatever ballerina performance thing as her cover, but she has to undergo this really rigorous no, I take that back. She wants to be a ballerina and doesn't want to go into the spy service, and then they break her leg so that she has to be a spy. I think that's what happens, but there is a connection to the ballerina. Anyway, I'm rambling, but you get the idea. So let's move on, I guess, unless there's any closing comments to Empty Man, and then we'll give it a whirl and then close up.
Yeah, do you mind if we pause for a quick minute before we do Empty Man?
No.
Yeah, just 1 second.
Yeah, I mean, just one more note on La Femme Nikita, because you guys kind of provoked my thinking about this. And to the extent that Nikita is this sort of ideal of the she's this rebel that's recruited to become a sort of just sort of become a god, sort of be to achieve this apotheosis. And I mean, I think that's the revelation about cultural engineering going on in the movie, and where the music programming part of it that I was kind of touching on comes in, is that, I mean, we're all sort of Nikita, right? We're all being programmed, we're all rebels, but we're actually, our rebellion is just part of the programming. I mean, this is what Jason Horsley calls the second matrix, right? Is that even Gnosticism is being sold. I mean, that's the great paradox of Gnosticism being used as a lever of control, right? As religious engineering, where it's selling people liberation as a way to control them. I mean, that is kind of a way to describe pop culture, whether you're talking about advertising or whatever, especially using your erotic energies, especially to control, using desire to control you, which is the essence of a lot of forms of magic. So yeah, I mean, I just wanted to make that conclusion about Nikita, and where the musical programming stuff fits into that. But yeah, you guys did a really great job analyzing it.
And before we move on, I want to point out that, of course, the show sponsor is, as everybody knows, chalk.com. They're a great company. I've been using their products for multiple weeks now, probably about 3-4 weeks. And I have to say that the daily is definitely something that I would check out if I were you. They, of course, source all their products strictly from the legit rainforest, straight up from the rainforest. They have strict purity tests. All of their ingredients are 100% organic, no contaminants whatsoever. I also recommend the Tonkat in terms of energy and boosting testosterone. I've been taking those two for the last 3 weeks. I've branched out now to trying the Shilajit, which, if you're a lady, you would probably be more amenable to something like the Shilajit. Probably don't want to boost a lot of testosterone if you're a lady, but if you're looking to find mental clarity, focus, especially when it comes to doing a lot of reading, do a lot of research, if that's your thing, I've found the Shilajit to help me a lot, especially the Action 2.0 in terms of energy. But there's also things like Chalk Armor, which is good immunoaptogen support. There's good support in terms of inflammation, enhances your resistance to stress, supports calm focus, serotonin synthesis, aka happiness, stimulant-free energy, and mitochondrial energy production when it comes to the chalk armor. And then also I plan the next couple weeks to branch out beyond the 5 that I've sampled to the ashwagandha. And ashwagandha is good for healthy mood and focus, hormone optimization, emotional well-being, optimal sleep and energy, and muscle mass, actually. So if you are interested, you want to support Jay's analysis and help your own health, then you definitely want to go to chalk.com right now and use the promo code JAY60, which will give you 60% off. They've extended that, which they had gotten rid of at least a couple weeks ago. And now they brought it back because they want to move the product that they have. And with supply chain shocks, we don't know how long we're going to have access to all these things. So definitely go over to chalk.com right now and use those promo codes to support both me and the wonderful based red pill company, chalk.com. All right, let's move on to Empty Man. And also, I want to remind everybody, follow and subscribe to Psyop Cinema. Do you guys have a Patreon, right?
Yeah, we do. Patreon.com/Psyop
yeah.
Cinema. We put up bonus content there. Fairly, we've only started doing this podcast fairly recently, but something that we'll be doing in general is like either together, like you mentioned earlier, we did an analysis of David Lowery's The Green Knight, which, even if you don't like the movie, like a lot to learn about what's going on ideologically there. But just Brett is doing an ongoing series on Monarch movies about trauma-based mind control. I just did a Psyoptober series where I looked at a few horror movies I really like. And so all of that is content people will be getting exclusively from our Patreon. And so if people like what they hear, and talking to you right now, in addition to our main features of going through mostly series on directors, we'll have our final episode on Zack Snyder coming out soon, and then we'll be moving on to David Fincher. But if people like what we're doing and really want to help, support this opening, of the field of religious studies of religious engineering, we're a new podcast, and so please, follow us on Twitter at Cinema Psyop and Patreon.com/Psyop Cinema.
Yeah, and I will include the Patreon link too. By the way, I forgot to put that in the show description. I just did the link to Spreaker, but I'll add the Patreon link, of course. So, all right, let's get to Empty Man, which is when I did my analysis, it was right when I was reading. I didn't plan it, but I was reading Leary's psychedelic experience, where he's supposed to be as your shaman handler, leading you through the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And really, what I see this book as is as a manual for mind controlling people as a pseudo wannabe shaman. I mean, that's really the way Leary ends this book, is basically saying, follow my techniques and principles, and you will be able to guide people through their trips, and you will be their shaman, aka the handler. So when I read this book, it was right when Empty Man came out. So I'm watching Empty Man, and I'm like, this is kind of, Tibetan Buddhist influence. Is really weird, timing there, that both of these things at the same time. But so I have some points that I'll get to in terms of how I see this as connected to a nihilistic, version of Tibetan Buddhism, in the sense that, what if the Tibetan Buddhist story is the way that we would actually describe the end of the world or something? And I actually see this as kind of an Antichrist style thing, because the guy at the end, it's almost like he's going to be the vessel for this empty man, who is really just this sort of dark, demonic or Luciferian force that's going to needs a vessel to fill. And so, spoiler alert, I assume everybody's seen the movie. The main character is the empty man. He's the vessel, right, for the demon, ultimately, is what we find out at the end. And, just one last point before I'll let you guys take over, is that it's also kind of, I think, an attitude of the elite perspective of humanity as empty husks, as vessels for them to fill with whatever they want. And ultimately, you becoming a vessel for the dark spirit of this sort of apocalypse, right? I mean, that's how I see this. I see this as kind of a nihilistic end of the world scenario, and every man is becoming the empty man to be filled with this dark light for the end.
Yeah, I mean, this movie really, really blew my mind, just in terms of the amount of threads of alternative spirituality and the New Age and like Eastern philosophy and the occult, like all coming together. Um, it's and the weaponization of syncretic Eastern philosophy in particular. I mean, it's a weird movie. It's got this kind of odd structure. It's long. It kind of varies in tone. It's got that whole like long opening period with like the Himalayan hike, and then it's got a little bit of a weaker section of the movie, kind of toward the middle, where it's almost like this Bye Bye Man-esque urban legend, like ghost story.
Yeah, it's like different movies in one. It's weird.
It is weird, but it picks up like crazy toward the end. And just like a comment about like, the quality of the film, like, it's nothing really to write home about, but, James Badgedale has a pretty good performance as this like former detective, James Lasombra, who he's like, his performance, he's like just everyman enough to be like frustrated and exasperated and kind of weirded out by everything going on. But it's also heightened enough performance to provide this kind of hard-boiled detective feel that keeps the tone of the movie engaging for the most part. But really, I think a line to begin with is that really shows what's going on here is there's a line about this cult at the center of the movie that says, on the surface, it's all this oneness, hippie self-empowerment bullshit, but they're dangerous. And so that's really the core of the movie, is it's telling us a lot about the actual initiatory dynamics of New Age thought and the trajectory of elite ideology being filtered in through the New Age and new religious movements. There's this, kind of great triple entendre with this line of, I grew up in San Francisco, because on one, for one thing, it's him being exasperated about like how lame all this pseudo spirituality is, but then it's also repetition to create himself as the Tulpa. We see in the file on him, this newspaper article about growing up in San Francisco, where he gets the line from, and it's just about literally like the New Age, just like, kind of like having so many of its origins and like so much of a hub in San Francisco.
Right.
But it brings in, not just this, it's part of the movie seems like a Buddhism themed horror movie, and that's really interesting and fascinating. But then there's such an explicit reference to Western occultism as well. I made sure to like pause and like look at like the Wikipedia article when the detective character is like reading about the Pontifex Institute and reading about tulpas and all of that. It explicitly talked about tulpas as a concept in Western occultism as well. So we're that whole lineage of that goes through Crowley and back through alchemy and hermeticism and all of these things. There's a reference in that same Wikipedia article to Satanism when it's talking about the guy who founded this cult was benefacted at one point by, I think, a widow who was a Satanist, this wealthy person in San Francisco. So there's like just a literal on its face satanic reference there with all the Eastern stuff and all the kind of generic occultism. It kind of rings some notes that evoke Scientology sometimes with the whole like wealthy self-help cult kind of thing. You kind of get that feel when he's like going into their building and looking at their questionnaire, and you're seeing all these posters and slogans and stuff. And with like that Scientology thing, there's the whole L. Ron Hubbard connections to Aleister Crowley, to Jack Parsons, to like SRI style parapsychology. A lot of those people were Scientologists. Of course, just Scientology is basically an exotheology cult, so that's important to keep in mind. So there's all of that. There's even a hint of kind of more like pagan folk horror kind of stuff with like that ritual scene around the fire that could be out of Wicker Man or stuff like that. But just some of the really specific references to these kind of New Age alt spirituality concepts, it just really shocked me with how forthcoming it is, and even like talking about the noosphere, talking about this field of consciousness, and concepts that really are related to someone like Teilhard de Chardin or someone like that, or even to someone like Ken Wilber, who the name Wilbur Parsons is the guy who founded the cult. I wondered if that was like Jack Parsons, Ken Wilber.
Yeah.
So,
is it Wilbur or is it Arthur?
Arthur's father was Wilbur. If you look at
okay, because Parsons is definitely Jack Parsons.
Parsons is definitely Jack Parsons, but just with axiosystematics or whatever it's called, got me thinking more about the spiral dynamics or integral thinking or some of those more New Agey Ken Wilber type things. So could be reaching, but with the explicit reference to the noosphere, I don't think it is. But but to bring it around to another line from the movie, it's these aren't just flakes and outcasts. They don't have 5-year plans; they have 500-year plans. You have no idea.
Well, that's what's so revelatory and so chilling with this movie at the same time is that it's the different layers of initiation in the cult. For each one, there's a different teaching or a different religious culture, and seeing like what this plan is, this 500-year plan, not 5-year plan, that all of these different ideologies and religions and cultural trends and are really like, what are they ultimately serving, right? That's what's so revelatory. And where do we find out this? It doesn't originate from human beings at all, right? It doesn't originate from the Pontifex Institute. It originates from a demon, so it's like, in a sense, it's like culture, basically, like our whole culture, to the extent that, post 60s, right, at least, the culture that's been generated by SLN and all of this, and that's maybe colonized the whole culture. The old culture now has become pop culture. When you watch the Marvel movies, that is suggesting all of this comes from a demon. I mean, there's nothing ambiguous about it. Like if you watch the movie,
that's what's surprising is that so many times the New Age is presented, with the hippie, nice, granola bar cover, and then it's actually, every now and then you'll have somebody from that domain telling you what's really behind it, right? I mean, every now and then you'll get a person who basically says, no, this is actually a Luciferian, movement. I mean, Leary would basically say that at times. I'm the successor to Aleister Crowley. I'm here to bring in this Luciferian age. The New Age has what's Dave McGowan's book, right? The Dark Heart of the counterculture is actually something very satanic, very dark and demonic. It is not something primarily peace and love oriented. That's just the front. And it's ironic because when you look at the Tibetan Buddhist view, I mean, it's a religion full of demons. It's full of the demonic, right? I mean, the Tibetan Book of the Dead is basically you on a journey, a trip through the domains of a bunch of different demons, right? Demonic kingdoms. And so, in that regard, Leary and these people are much more revelatory than the baloney, liberal front that we usually see in the front of the New Age movement. And that's what this film is about, is basically that it's like you said, it's from a demon. And then one other thing I was wanted to point out too was, did you notice the Lynchian influences too? There's several themes and elements and imagery that's straight up David Lynch in this film.
Like what did you have in mind specifically?
Oh, it's either this, I think, is based on a comic book or something, but it literally looks just like Twin Peaks. The cover of the comic book looks just like something from Twin Peaks. There's a couple shots where the cinematography is exactly moves that Lynch has done at different times. It's been a while since I watched it, but if you go watch my analysis, I actually covered more specifics of that. But that's my read of this, is that it's, and that makes sense too, because I mean, David Lynch is, Twin Peaks is all about tulpas and Zen Buddhism. Oh, excuse me, Tibetan Buddhism.
Right. Yeah, the Lynch connection makes sense, and there's kind of an oblique David Fincher connection as well, in as much as if you've seen it, like look at an interview with David Pryor, the director of this movie, like, he knows Fincher well. He's kind of, his background before making this is that it's just like minor things like directing, I think, special features for DVD releases of Fincher movies like Zodiac and The Social Network. And he's got a new show that's like all about cinema that's on Netflix that is forthcoming, that he's making, this guy with Fincher, and that he reportedly David Fincher saw in like The Empty Man as well. So there's all kind of weird dynamics behind the scenes with how long it took this movie to get released. Like it was like being filmed in 2016, doesn't come out until last year, and the director seems pretty bitter about that. And so how much of that is intentional or staged or what's going on there, I don't really know. But the Fincher connection I thought was interesting as well. And that's more of an oblique connection in terms of the filmmaking. Maybe some of like the color grading of the movie is occasionally Fincher adjacent, but in terms of style. But it'll be interesting to see what happens with this Netflix show that the two of them are doing together.
Yeah, the urban legend, element of it, that, I mean, I guess I like that a little bit more than you did, but in a way that's kind of what makes this movie unique in this particular, you know, in the conspiracy genre, if you will, because I mean, like the connecting deep politics with the New Age is kind of what Inherent Vice is about. You know, and you know, bringing and the relationship between Eastern philosophy, I think, and the New Age and the counterculture is kind of implied and already well known. But with the urban legend element is like bringing in this nihilistic youth culture and saying this is part of the same programming, you know, sort of agenda. So you create a bunch of nihilists who don't believe in anything, and then they're ready to believe in anything. So they show up and they're getting this New Age pablum, you know, in the Masonic, and they're and what is the Masonic checkerboard about?
That's a great point. Yeah. I didn't catch
Well, they're confused. So that's of course what the black and white is. Was that they show up totally confused. So you create a culture of people that are totally confused, and then they show up and they're, you know, and they're ready for programming. And the next level inside is they're going to get this sort of Eastern philosophy. They're going to get a more serious Eastern philosophy after they've gotten through the New Age pablum, and then that's going to lead into, you know, summoning demons. And but what are they trying to do? They're trying to get the kids basically to summon demons. You know, they're selling those. It's interesting too. There's, if you look at that, those personality tests that you have to fill out, you know, when he's sitting in the waiting room, I'm looking at some of the, one of them says, it's asking, I guess it's asking if you agree with these statements. It's that sort of multiple choice thing. And one of them says, suicide is a form of mind control, or is a form of thought control, you know, is one of the things written there. But I'm sorry, Jay, I didn't mean to step over you there. I just.
No. I mean, I didn't even think about that with because the first act is with all of those, they're like Gen X, right? Or like maybe millennial. No, more like they're a little older, right? And then when we get to the town, you know, suburbs storyline with the, you know, urban legend, they're the youth, they're more like Gen Z, Zoomers, basically. I didn't even think about that we had gone from, you know, the one age group to another age group to bring them in, and then the children of those who were raised in the 60s counterculture have surrendered to these Far Eastern, you know, spiritualities which underlie the New Age, which allows them, as you said, to be kind of the vessels to be filled with anything. So the cults are thriving because they're able to fill these empty vessels with something new.
Yeah, exactly. And if you look at the school that these kids go to in the movie, it's Jacques Derrida High School.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
You know, which I think
they've been deconstructed and now they can be reconstructed.
Exactly. And so like that's a hint, I think, of what we're dealing with from forces like the cult in the movie. Is just, it's an influx of like every possible means of deconstruction, which makes people like the characters in the movie ultimately vulnerable to, like we were talking about earlier, like a Luciferian reconstruction. You know, it's kind of like, you know, the religion of the future, as Father Seraphim Rose talks about it being made possible by nihilism as a product of revolutionary philosophy, like you've talked about in your streams on Father Seraphim Rose's work. But it's this esoteric syncretism with this end goal of like dissolution of all categories, which you know, I was talking about this a bit earlier, but again, it's a breakdown of defenses against spiritual intrusion. This whole emptiness thing is really just ultimately, it's this red herring. It's a smokescreen that's nudging us towards mediumship. The religion of the future is a religion of possession. Yeah. It's this neo-shamanic pagan paradigm, all about letting it enter. That's where all this nihilism, all this Gnosticism, all this psychedelia nonsense, it's just getting people to a place where they feel like logically set up to be comfortable with letting in entities. Like the movie shows us so well with the empty man creature continually advancing against those he's haunting. And so in that aspect, I really like the more like the kind of hokey horror, like ghost story aspect of the movie, because it really shows that like all of this aspect of occulture and like the New Age, it is a horror story.
Yeah. Well, and when we get to the point, there's a specific line that made me think that it was sort of an Antichrist-ish anticipatory story, because when he's talking to the younger guy in the parking lot, and he's like, the younger guy says something like, "You have no idea what you are." He says something like, "You are the end," or something like that.
Right.
Which made me think, oh, so he is kind of the culmination of the 500-year plan, which is not just the next instantiation of empty man, but actually like the end of the world.
Right, because the ultimate example of possession and of summoning, like all of mediumship, is like letting the Antichrist into the world from this ideological perspective.
Yeah, so the possession is meeting a culmination, which is the inverse of the incarnation.
Right. That's why, all these like different occult splinter groups and new age movements are all so apocalyptic, is because it's ultimately they're all grasping at trying to be the one that opens this final portal, which is what makes all this bridge imagery in the movie so chilling, because it's just like
That's
trying.
right. Yeah. There's multiple bridges. Exactly. Every sequence has the bridge. That's right.
Right.
Like the first act, second act, third act have the bridge. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like the main character.
Okay, go ahead. Oh yeah, Pontifex is the bridge.
Yes. Good point.
Maker, yeah.
Right. Like ultimately every character is the empty man. It's the main character is the ultimate example of it. But the idea is just like, there's just an extra step involved with that. With everyone else, it's just like, it's letting him just like take you to this emptiness, this nihilism. Yeah.
And why maybe I'm pushing the Antichrist theme too much with it. Maybe they weren't that conscious with it, but it's interesting that you have the notion that, Satan or this demon figure needs a body to inhabit, but the bodies that he inhabits, because he's so powerful as a demon, he kind of saps them really quick. And so they don't last very long. So he has to get a new one pretty quick. So now what they've done is like, oh, what if we create a mental body, which is, we create a tulpa body for the demon, which is interesting. But is that what's going on here, or am I pushing too many religious narratives at once to blend the Tibetan Buddhism and the Christian notion? What do you guys think? Is that too much?
No, I don't think it's too much at all. I think the movie is pretty explicit, like where that's going, where the guy is told, like, just like the cultist like tells him, no, like you don't know what's coming, like, like your nightmares or premonitions of what's to come. There's like all these moments of deja vu or glimpses of the new, like this whole, like it's really a combination of, I think like, tulpas in the Western occult sense, and this, more like Eastern spiritual sense, like, and like what's underlying like all of these different traditions, which is like ultimately the religion of the future, this Luciferian drive for summoning, which is kind of dovetails with some of those more like AI robotics things you're talking about earlier. But just like it's through any means necessary, we are going to create a body for Antichrist. This movie doesn't do the tech angle. We see that in plenty of other cases, like we pointed out earlier.
Right.
But in this case, like the idea of creating a tulpa, of just creating it's the idea of something with the tulpa thing that I think is pretty interesting is just thinking about the significance of tulpas for just the broader dynamics of Hollywood or watching movies. Like that's something that Jason Horsley in his excellent book, 16 Maps of Hell, which everyone really should read. He has some great passages on that, how a lot of like writers and authors who are into like Alan Moore, Neil Gaiman, they talk a lot about tulpas in their work. But then like but even with the concept of like actors, like who we project so much onto, or the creation of these characters who become part of the life of the mind, in culture, like something like the Joker or something like that, is really this feedback loop of a tulpa of something that's informing our unconscious energies that we're putting into the system, but then we're creating it as well. So that loop just goes around and around.
Well, and Jay has said, I think in one of your recent shows, you were mentioning Freddy Krueger as an instantiation of a tulpa. And in this context, it's especially fascinating because I know that Wes Craven got the idea for Nightmare on Elm Street from newspaper articles that he read about people dying in their dreams in Cambodia, people who'd experienced the killing fields and, all the slaughter and stuff over there. And the idea that you could, that trauma basically could kill you in the form of a dream, was so fascinating to him. So, Freddy Krueger there, again, he's himself sort of a metaphor and allegory for a kind of psychological warfare, a kind of and I think that's my interpretation of, the points about the kind of Antichrist are well taken, but it's interesting. There's all this like heavy occult and religious stuff, but it's philosophers who get more like explicit mention. There's the Jacques Derrida thing. He mentions Nietzsche, the Stephen Root character. And that's very telling because he's talking about the abyss and how there must be basically some abyss in you if you can look at the abyss. And he's basically trying to get his initiates, including the main character, to identify themselves with this nothingness, like with this abyss, which then of course leads them into mediumship. So it's like, Eastern, the new ageism is the entree to Eastern religion as this program for making you receptive to possession. But it's but identifying yourself, you're made in the image of God, but identifying yourself with the nothingness, is this sort of inversion or negation of Christianity. It's a destruction of the soul, and this is a theme we see in hardware as well, like this, media and toxic culture, and then which has this origin, right, in all of these cultural engineering religious programs, is destructive, of the human soul, basically. I mean,
Well,
that's kind of
so
how I
yeah,
read it.
some of the left-hand path serious satanic people, like Father Seven Rose talks about, they take non-being and nothingness to be the highest form of expression of their religion. And so sometimes Satan is even kind of pictured as this angel of non-being or nothingness because of his flight from the good, God being supreme being itself. The inversion of that would be the angel of nothingness, or the flight into non-being, which is not to say that Satan actually literally doesn't exist, but that his very existence is predicated on a perpetual willing of non-existence. And so he is kind of locked in this desire to destroy anything that has existence, especially anything to do with man, because man's made in the image of Christ. So Satan is this perpetually non-being willing creature. And I think that that's really one of the things that makes so many of the Far Eastern religions so fundamentally satanic, is that they're all predicated on you negating yourself and becoming or aligning with pure non-being and non-existence, which is really just another form of suicide.
Right. It makes me think of the line from the movie, like early on when he's talking to like the young lady who turns out to be part of the cult. And she says something like, nothing can hurt you because nothing is real.
Yes.
Which that brings me back to kind of what we were talking about earlier in terms of like hardware, the world is imperfect and grimy. So let's just like kill everyone. Let's get this false catharsis, because if everything's imperfect, we have to, currently that means we have to negate anything. So if there's pain in the world, and either everything, it must be pain, or we have, these people want to unleash this like crazy satanic apocalypse.
No, believe it or not, that we just covered with Tristan, some of the vegans and the radical animal rights vegans people, they're now positing that in order to stop suffering, we should like destroy everything. So I'm serious, they've come to like a full self-consciousness with their radical anti-human philosophy, that it's now expanded beyond, because they're starting to realize that like there's predatory animals. And so they're like, well, maybe we should actually kill all those animals too. No, wait, maybe we should just kill everything, because then there wouldn't be suffering, because that's their motivation in terms of their like extinction rebellion, attitude.
Sure, that's where everything's converging on just like this ultimate, just like will annihilation. The quiet part is being said out loud, a lot more and a lot more. And so it's this, again, it's like this false binary, like we talked about some when you were on our show, about this false binary between just like absolute like hedonism and just like indulgence in the flesh, versus on the other hand just like absolute despising and casting out of the flesh and complete negation of that. Like lines in this movie, there's no solving cases like this, it's inexplicable, it's too big, we can't indict the cosmos. So just again, this fundamental pessimism, but then this also like there's like a kind of this nonsensical circularity to like this the Pontifex Institute's philosophy in this movie, where they're both responding to trauma and trying to solve it, but they're also causing it and doing all these violent things. So again, this nonsensical circularity you get in some of these philosophies exemplified really well by the fact that it's like the empty man is haunting the empty man in this movie. Like the empty man is the main character, but he's being haunted by the ghost, the empty man. So it's all of these just nonsensical feedback loops that the elites are trapped in, that they want us all to be trapped in too. And like with movies like this, I think it's a way of like messing with our minds to really get us into these thought loops.
Well, keep in mind too, Pontifex, I don't know how self-conscious the screenplay writer would have been, but I mean, that's classically a title that the Roman emperor had that was then appropriated by the Bishop of Rome. So as the Bishop of Rome, increased in his own understanding of himself to believe that he's the bridge between God and this world, he becomes the Pontifex Maximus in an extreme sense in the rise of medieval, papalatry. And so, if there is a deeper significance to the theology of this, there could be a reference to the papacy as well. Given that that's one of the most famous titles of the Pope is the Pontifex.
Right.
Yeah, the other thing is the angle that he's, basically James is it seems like there's a kind of parallel way to read what's happening. We haven't really talked about the ending and how to interpret this. So like he's basically being inculcated with this Eastern philosophy that nothing exists essentially, and he's nothing. But I mean, it seems to me like if the film were like really pushing a non-dualist, sort of philosophy, the protagonist would also come to understand that like even the people running this experiment on him are also empty. But it seems like that's all just completely a psyop. There's some other kind of reality going on, and maybe they realize he's just simply a mind control victim, because at least there's the trauma element of it, right? Why does he have to get, like, why do they have to give him this? Just same thing comes up in Dark City. It's right. Why are they giving him these traumatic memories? What's the purpose of it? To study him or what? Well, it makes him a better medium, right? It opens up, and so that's why the other guy, right, had to be traumatized so that he could become. And it said that he was in Bellevue and he was moved into these psychiatric. I mean, was he a mind control subject before or after he fell in the pit and had this dark enlightenment experience? And the same thing I think applies to how you interpret what's going on. Was he a subject of a psychiatric experiment? So I mean, I think there's a direct, almost. I mean, it seemed to me pretty obvious, right, that they were. And they even showed these weird shots of him like in a room, tied, strapped down to a chair.
Yeah. So maybe he's not. This is just the perspective of what the cult has inculcated him with, right?
Right, because what I'm trying to say is the movie it's doing this thing that like Inception does, and so many of these Gnostic movies do. Right, is it's showing that this idea, like what Amanda tells him, that the world isn't real, this message he keeps getting. I mean, the movie is showing you this is a way to control and manipulate, but at the same time, it's actually inculcating into fear. So it's showing you as an Inception that this is a toxic idea. It led to the guy's wife's death. It led to Leo's wife's death in Inception. But Nolan himself is, especially with the ending, is incepting this destructive, soul-destroying idea within you. And this movie is doing the same thing. Right, so you're the mind control. You're made to. I mean, he even says that you're made to. The audience is supposed to identify, or no, he describes how the narrative is supposed to represent the atomizing consciousness of the character. And you definitely get the sense that, especially in the first act of the film, that he's using these sort of devices, these sonic devices, and all of these techniques to make you identify with the catatonic state, of the character. So that's. Go ahead, Thomas.
Yeah, I think that's that reading is very important, because when you have scenes like where he's like looking through the files on himself and on all these other people, like there's definitely a mind control kind of creation of like a molding of the psyche like aspect that I think is being heavily implied there. So the idea that like there, like even no matter how you read the ending of the movie metaphysically, it's within the text of the movie that he is an experiment of some kind, that this cult is messing with people's heads and it's creating artificial identities. That's what creating a tulpa is. And so like that shows really what's underneath like this, all this, like new age hokey stuff about finding your true self, or like this deeper occult Crowley style like stuff of like a divinization of the self that might be related to those other ideologies. But really it's a creation of the false self that the elite system can consume, can devour, can control, can like merge into the technological grid. No matter how you read the movie metaphysically, like that mind control MK Ultra element, it's right there.
Yeah, that is a great point. It's entirely possible to read this not as an actual, metaphysics of the apocalypse through the lens of Tibetan Buddhism. It could be that James was in this cult, given this traumatic, weird, like, alternative worldview. And so that's the means by which he becomes the vehicle for the cult to then worship him as the instantiation of this demon that the cult follows, right?
Especially when you consider when the role of induced amnesia and things, MPD, DID type of stuff, it's easy to understand it. I mean, it seemed very obvious to me that there was at least a subtext of that was deliberately inserted here.
Right.
Which works very well with the Antichrist angle and all of that, because that's what occult ideology is. It's to make everyone delusional, thinking you're the Antichrist, maybe not literally, but like to seek apotheosis, to seek gnosis, to be like, you are the frontier of cosmic knowledge. So just like find your true self and divinize your true self. So basically in like the cult world, they would be doing this, like, you know, their ideal world, this like everyone becomes the empty man. Everyone is deluded to thinking they're the empty man and thus becoming the empty man through the delusion.
Well, that's the thing with the Eastern philosophies, is that the whole presupposition is divest yourself of your own ego and identity, become empty, right? And that's supposedly the pathway to, you know, thusness or whatever. But really what is ironic is that Tibetan Buddhism is a little closer to hitting the nail on the head, because it's actually pointing out, no, you can become empty to be a vessel for the demonic. like it's darker than just being, oh, I'm gonna be empty, dude. So like, I mean, really all of these techniques are about the influences and inspirations from the noetic, you know, realm, to, as you said, to become a channel, really.
And I think the movie is trafficking in a certain occult technique of messing with the audience's head by like giving you like the idea that, you know, you've got this mind virus now. You've thought about the empty man. Now he's coming for you too.
Now he's coming for you. Now that you thought about him. Yeah.
It made me think about a certain like contemporary like occult philosopher, Nick Land, who kind of like writes in these terms of like mind viruses and stuff like that a lot. Like there's a line toward the end of the movie where like there's like where the word carrier for the empty man means both like a carrier signal and like a disease. And like, you know, like people like occultists like this guy Land, you know, they like, he wrote something called like hypervirus once, you know, and like he has this idea of hyperstition, of like fictions that become real over time. And there's this occult practice of like calling the outside into reality through fiction.
Well, that's, I mean, that would suggest then that the movie is implanting the idea in everyone else as the tulpa. The idea that the movie produces is the tulpa in the real world. Exactly.
It's you know, like there's this like thing toward the end of the movie where you find out, at least in the cults, the paradigm, that this character first came into being at this like Mexican restaurant on his birthday 3 days ago, which is the first time the audience saw him. So it's like, oh my God, I brought the empty man into existence.
Exactly. Yeah.
By the way, that's exactly the that Nick Land's perspective is exactly the perspective that Stanley adopts. He wrote this article about sort of Cthulhu as a religious meme. I'll just quote this one quote from the article. It says, "We are witnessing something akin to a psychoactive virus that has finally reached pandemic status, or what evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins termed a religious meme, a new idea style fad or form of behavior spread through imitation and capable of evolving through natural selection in a similar manner to biological, you know, evolution." So, you know, Stanley subscribes to the same.
Well, that's why a lot of these artists who are self-consciously into the occult or ritual magic or whatever, I mean, they believe that they're partaking of this great work. And so their artwork is part of bringing this great work to its culmination, which ultimately we know is Antichrist.
What's the name of the restaurant, by the way? Because David Pryor said there was some clue in that. I couldn't find the name.
I didn't catch that. I'll have to look back on that. But the Lovecraft angle, I think, is really important, because that's something else that David Pryor talks about. You know, an interview I found out with him, which is a really big hint about the dynamics of the movie, is that he cites Lovecraft as this major influence, like on himself, and he says he's always been interested in Lovecraftian horror. So, you know, the basic, you know, the creeping dread of the cosmic horror that rewires and shatters and breaks our perception of time and space, you know. And so like the ironic thing, there's a lot of ironic things about Lovecraft, you know, one of them being that like, you know, he's this Anglophile kind of projecting the occult legacy of his Anglo heritage onto these kind of like ecstatic cults of other races, when really, you know, the Anglo-imperial heritage is shot through with occult projects, you know, of letting in the outside and, you know, and all of that. And, you know, the Anglo-Imperium is this total like occult project, you know, that where these, and Lovecraft is so popular, and chaos magicians, and like so many other like modern kind of post-Crowleyan occultists like Kenneth Grant and all of that, where, you know, the outside masquerades as true reality that'll break your mind because it's so true, when really it's just, you know, it's just delusions. And all these forms of kind of post-Lovecraftian occultism, you know, it's this universe of terror that tries to make you love the terror. I mean, for people who are into Lovecraft, and I enjoy Lovecraft as an author, but, you know, fans pay lip service, to this cosmic dread, but really it's only like pretending to be dread when it's this fixation. You're supposed to love Cthulhu, you're supposed to love Yog-Sothoth, you're supposed to think that they're really cool. And so like the darkness of this movie is the end is just like the Cthulhu fixation. It's like, whoa, the empty man wins and he becomes the empty man because the universe is so dark and bleak. Like this movie really is a psyop in that way.
Yeah, it's the same with the xenomorphs, right? I mean, the xenomorphs ultimately are the apex predator. They're the ultimate expression of a cold, heartless, nihilistic universe where, as you watch the series, the humans and the Weyland-Yutani Corporation are actually more devious than the xenomorphs. And there's a specific line where at one point it's either Ripley or Charlize Theron's character, I don't remember who, but at one point one of the characters is like, I think it's Ripley, she's like, at least they don't kill their own, and they're more moral than the humans, basically, which is, I think, showing again it's an anti-human worldview and narrative, but it's more consistent than like any of the other leftist narratives or worldviews. I mean, consistent in a dark way, right? I mean, if you didn't believe in God, then that's kind of the logical outworking of where your thought process ought to take you.
Right, for sure. And it's really important to remember that like all this stuff about like the empty man and the emptiness that's coming for us all and everything like behind these worldviews that you're describing, like it's creepy until just like you see like how silly it all is. And it's important to remember that it's really silly because it's just built on such a metaphysically sloppy foundation that's just masquerading as like edgy cold realism. You can deflate it all by just being like doing like a transcendental critique. Like, how do you know all that? Everything's emptiness. Did emptiness tell you that?
Yeah, exactly.
Again, it's just all a trick to get you to summon demons to take your
pre-sub the empty man, right? And he's gonna like collapse in the corner.
They're kind of like throwing every form of nihilism against the wall. So as James goes deeper and deeper into the in the inner court and eventually the sort of inner sanctum of the cult, he goes into the basement and he's going through this like barracks where they mind control people, and they're playing this quote attributed to the ancient Greek sophist Gorgias. Nothing exists. Even if something exists, nothing can be known about it. Even if something can be known about it, nothing can be communicated about it, to others. And so again, it should even beyond the outer court, outside the outer court, is the kind of urban legend sphere, the kind of trash culture, as Philip K. Dick would say, the kind of trash culture realm where this stuff exists, and it's cultural nihilism there. It's selling you suicide and phony rebellion and whatever, crossing the boundaries. It's that pop Gnosticism, and then you come in here and you have this epistemological nihilism, which is seen to be at the root of it, and then eventually it's demon possession. Once you're hollowed out, once you've been deconstructed in every way, you're ready for reprogramming.
Exactly. Yeah, great stuff. Anything you guys want to leave us with as we close, Empty Man?
One more thought on the movie is, like I already mentioned, kind of like the line that the cultist like tells him about, like where he emphasizes nightmares and deja vu. And so that just really reminded me of my own hobby horse about like temporality and just like how important like time and dreams are to the modern occult project, which you get like this whole thing on temporality from like from every, and like often the dreams thing, just like from a Terence McKenna, from a William Burroughs, like from a Nick Land. And so just the fact that when this like cultist is like talking about this like apocalyptic like end of the world, just like a summoning bridge thing and all of that, the fact that he talks about deja vu and nightmares just made me think about that and some of the themes that we talked about when you came on our show and talked about Come True.
Any closing comments?
Some occult Illuminati type of sort of Easter eggs, Devara, the girl, the friend that he goes to interview, who gets killed in the shower by the empty man. So before she gets killed, you see that she's covering her eye. By the way, James is doing the one eye pose, right, in his birthday restaurant shots. So she's obviously doing, it's very deliberate. When she does more subtle, maybe it was an accident. But in her case, it's not subtle. She does it. And then when she's looking up, it's a POV shot. So it's drawing attention to her eye and the angle. It's a POV shot. She's looking like, up into some sort of lattice work metal structures, and it's forming forming sort of a tilted, pentagram. And then she's stabbed in the eye in the shower. there's a tree of life woodcut in front of James's house when he comes out and sees Amanda, you know, out there. It just look,
Oh, I didn't catch
it's a
that.
big, just a big wooden tree of life, you know, woodcut. So we have this this Kabbalistic undertone, triangles, you know, everywhere. Yeah, those were the Easter eggs that I picked out of there.
And what are you guys gonna be covering next? I know you guys have been covering Snyder. What's up next on y'all's list?
David Fincher. So we've got
Cool.
one more Snyder episode that'll come
Right.
out shortly and kind of conclude our thoughts on him and on disassociative fantasies and religious engineering and all of that. But then we're working up to do a series on Fincher, which there's obviously going to be a ton to talk about there.
Oh yeah,
And
that's gonna be great. I can't wait
made
for
it
that.
interesting watching this movie, knowing that like Pryor is like doing something with Fincher for Netflix. So that's what we've got coming up. And otherwise, Brett will be continuing his series on our Patreon on Monarch movies. I'll have some more bonus content coming up there soon. But yeah, we're just really getting started with Psyop Cinema. So hope that if people enjoyed hearing us on here, that they'll stick with us, and you know, we can all deprogram ourselves together.
Yeah, I've enjoyed it, and look forward to the Fincher episode. So thank you guys so much for coming on, and definitely have a good night. And everybody in the audience, go follow and listen to and subscribe and support these guys on Patreon.
Yeah.
Thanks,
for having
Jay.
us on, Jay.
All right, thank you guys. Have a good night.
Have a good one.
Good night.